Istria begins in 3033 AD in the Flaming Tower. The action takes place in a high tower, which is completely covered with fire, and a red star is burning at the top. The whole land around the tower is covered with defeated monsters. People were fighting a huge monster that resembled a giant bird. She screamed loudly and used fire to fight. The man shouted furiously that the firebird's strength was almost at an end. He tightened his grip on his sword and shouted to his friends that they should finish her off. The muscular guy shouted angrily that he was. Along with them was a blue-haired girl who used magic. She screamed loudly that death was for him. They started attacking the bird from different sides. She screamed loudly that it was time for her to die. People began to strike at the monster quickly. She screamed loudly and growled. She fell from the very top of the tower straight to the bottom. The monster was defeated. The bird scattered its red feathers. She will never be able to fight again after this fight. A man and a girl approached the defeated bird. The muscular man stuck his sword next to the monster's head. They made sure that the bird would not attack them again. The man with white hair happily said that the guardian of the Flaming Tower was finally finished. He spoke in fragments because he couldn't catch his breath after the battle. He went on to say that now all that remains is. A girl and another man approached him from behind. The girl smiled angrily and said that now it was time for him to die. She looked very angry and happy. The blonde man turned in surprise. He couldn't understand what she meant. A muscular man and a girl with blue hair stuck a sword into him. He coughed and wheezed. He didn't expect this to happen. The man fell to the ground and asked with pain in his voice why they did it. He tried to reach out and touch them. He croaked that they had fought shoulder to shoulder for so many years. The girl smiled angrily and said that one monk carries water for himself. 2 monks carry water, helping each other. 3 monks have no one to carry water. She doubts that he does not know this truth, Xiao Ming. The muscular man gloated that his strength was too great. Once they got rid of him, they would no longer be threatened. They would become invincible. They pushed Xiao Ming directly towards the body of the firebird. He fell on her stomach and hissed in pain. Xiao Ming looked at them wearily and shouted that damn, they were terrible. The girl ran towards him shouting that he was still alive. They should attack him. They just have to erase his body and soul. The muscular man angrily replied that he was. He took his sword and headed towards his former friend. Suddenly, the bird got up from the ground and screamed loudly. She caught fire, which affected Xiao Ming as well. The man shouted loudly that the fire-feathered bird was still alive. The girl said tensely that it was bad. She wanted to self-destruct. It's time for them to leave. The bird exploded and everything was covered in fire. Xiao Ming caught fire and shouted loudly that Lai Wang and Long Huan should listen to him carefully. If there is a next life, he will do everything to make them regret today. The man was completely engulfed by the fire, and he did not resist it. A soul burst out of his body, which became the shape of a red star. He will take his revenge carefully. Identification and processing of the trajectories of the character's fate, loading the system. It's been 300 years since that day. The action will continue in Kunhai City at the Martial Arts Academy. On the street, students lined up in front of their teacher, as well as a box that was covered with a black cloth. The teacher said that 400 years ago, 9 towers of darkness fell from the sky, and from that moment the great invasion of abnormal beasts began. Humanity was unable to resist them and was in danger of extinction. The girl is a teacher of the 3rd group named Liu Jusi. The girl went on to say that fortunately for them, the rise of martial arts and the emergence of powerful warriors allowed them to overcome this terrible crisis. Humanity is very lucky that it has managed to live up to today. Liu Juxi grabbed the black cloth and said that today it was time for them to take a look at their mortal enemies. She pulled off the cloth and screamed that abnormal beasts. It turned out that under the black cloth there was a cage in which an evil monster was sitting. Lu Juxi said that in front of them was one of the abnormal lower-level beasts, namely the hyena. An abnormal beast of the national level is a hyena. The students approached the cage. They began to whisper, which means that this is the abnormal beast. He's so disgusting, it's just awful. The teenagers were laughing and pointing at the hyena. The monster looked at them angrily and snapped his teeth angrily. The students screamed in fright and ran away from the cage. They didn't expect the hyena to be so scary. Lu Juxi said with a smile that in the initial manual on abnormal beasts, they should have already received all the necessary knowledge about this beast. She asked with interest who would tell her about her weaknesses. The girl took the whip in her hands to attack the monster. The guy looked away and awkwardly said that the initial manual describes more than 1,000 abnormal animals. Who will remember them all? The other guy said sheepishly that you don't even have to look at him. Suddenly, everyone heard strange noises coming from behind. The guy asked in surprise what kind of strange sound it was. His friend asked if someone was snoring. Lu Juxi looked at her students in surprise, who were chatting about something. The students turned their heads and saw a guy who was leaning against a tree and sleeping. He smiled in his sleep as if deliberately provoking. Lu Juxi angrily shouted that Xiao Ming dares to sleep in her class. Is he really tired of living? The students fearfully moved away from her so as not to fall under her anger. The guy abruptly opened his eyes and looked at everyone in surprise. He shouted angrily that Lai Wn and Long Huan. What could they do to him? He was ready to jump into a fight. Xiao Ming was surprised to think that, wait, there's something wrong here. He looked at the students and the teacher in shock and asked what kind of place it was. Xiao Ming asked uncertainly that shouldn't he die after the self-destruct of the Firebird. The guy covered his face with his hand. The moments when he was last alive began to flash before his eyes. He and his companions were fighting the Firebird. Xiao Ming excitedly thought that, wait, these are memories. He was reborn 300 years later. Xiao Ming let go of his hand and laughed. He smiled and said that he could not have imagined that heaven would give him another chance at life. The guy shouted furiously that Lai Wang and Long Huan, since he was alive now, should expect an early reckoning from him. Lu Juxi jumped on him shouting, "What a reckoning! Had he reread the novels?" Her heel began to approach the guy's face. Xiao Ming was startled to think what was going on now. The teacher kicked the guy, who was thrown several meters away from the force of the blow. He slammed his whole body into a large tree with a loud bang. Lu Juxi furiously shouted that she could see that life was not pleasant for him at all, since he managed to sleep in her class. The girl was very angry at Xiao Ming. Xiao Ming fell to the ground after colliding with a tree. The impact was so strong that a mark was left on the tree. The students began to laugh and whisper that everyone knows how harsh Lu Black Stockings can be. That loser Xiao Ming was looking for a beating. Someone gloated that yes, it looked like he had finally given up. They are not surprising. With such a low vitality index, he will never become a warrior, so it doesn't make much sense for him to understand abnormal beasts. The student said that it was high time for such losers to be kicked out of the academy. He doesn't understand at all how he still has the conscience to show up in class. Xiao Ming clutched his aching head and asked in surprise that they were in class now. He was shocked to think that this was how it was. Judging by the memories of the former owner, today is the day of the lesson on the study of abnormal beasts, and he, in turn, is just a student of the Martial Arts Academy. The guy looked at the hyena in the cage and continued to argue that he used to be able to destroy animals of the imperial level. And now he has to study animals of the national, lower level. How strange it all is. Suddenly, a girl raised her hand and told Teacher Lu that due to difficult family circumstances, student Xiao Ming had to do part-time jobs after classes. A guy named Kang laughingly asked what the headman was doing now, why she was standing up for this loser. Kang looked very arrogant when he talked about Xiao Ming. The guy smiled angrily and said that whatever it was, intermediate testing would begin in a month. If he fails it, he will be kicked out of the academy. Qin Ying looked at him with displeasure and said that, but Lu Zhuzi shouted loudly that that was enough. Everyone should calm down now. She clutched the whip in her hands and told Xiao Ming that he was still a student of the academy, which meant he was her student. She leaned over to the guy and angrily said that now he should tell her where the weaknesses of abnormal hyenas are located. If he does not answer, he will rewrite the initial manual on abnormal beasts 10 times. The students laughed and whispered that he probably had no idea which page contained information about abnormal hyenas, how he would be able to name its weaknesses. Someone said that the thickness of the initial allowance is so great that it can kill a person. He thinks that Xiao Ming will finish rewriting it 10 times only when the cancer on the mountain whistles. The guy laughed out loud and said that yes, you wouldn't envy him. Qin Ying looked at Teacher Lu excitedly and asked that she didn't think it was too much to rewrite 10 times. After all, Xiao Ming was not so guilty. Lu Zhuzi looked at the girl angrily and asked with displeasure that she would teach her to do her own job. Qin Ying looked at her in fright. She did not expect such a reaction. The headman lowered her head and awkwardly tried to say something to the teacher. Kang stared at the girl and wondered why Qin Ying was always trying to protect this loser. Was there really something between them? Xiao Ming smiled and said with a laugh that it was necessary to name the weaknesses of abnormal hyenas. He has been well versed in them for a long time. This is a very easy question. The guy thought intensely that in those days, when he had just become a warrior, he had slaughtered an entire flock of 80 hyenas in order to hone the art of wielding a blade. He will point out their weak points even with his eyes closed. The students laughed and started pointing at the guy. They shouted that yes, this guy knows how to show off. The guy hysterically shouted that yes, if he could name all the weak points of the abnormal hyenas, he would eat something terrible right here. Lu Zhuzi said that since he was so confident in himself, she wanted to listen to him carefully. The girl looked completely confident that the guy didn't know anything. She leaned over and poked him in the chin with the whip. Lu Zhuzi said with an evil smile that if he answered incorrectly, it would be bad. Xiao Ming looked at her intently. The guy gathered his thoughts and smiled broadly. Xiao Ming confidently said that as far as he knows, abnormal hyenas have 4 weak points. Lu Zhuzi looked at him in surprise. She did not expect that he would actually say something. She thought excitedly that this kid knew about the 4th point. The group of guys laughed out loud when they heard Xiao Ming's reply. One of them shouted that abnormal hyenas have only 3 weak points, from where he took the 4th. His friend replied that he didn't even doubt that this loser didn't know anything. Qin Ying frustratedly told Xiao Ming that the initial manual indicated only 3 weak points in abnormal hyenas. She looked away so as not to show her concern. Xiao Ming looked at the girl in surprise and asked that there were only 3. This could not be. The guy confidently said that there must be some mistake in their textbooks. Kang pointed at Xiao Ming and shouted angrily at him to stop acting like he didn't know what. The book says in black and white that abnormal hyenas have only 3 weak points, namely the throat, abdomen, and eyes. He stepped forward a little and said with a smile that to think that an ordinary trash who failed the last exam thinks he can question the teaching materials. The students laughed loudly at his words. Kang shouted at Teacher Liu that Xiao Ming had the audacity not only to sleep in class, but also to question the authenticity of the teaching materials. He proposes to ban him from the academy for a while as a punishment. Let him reflect a little on his actions. Xiao Ming chuckled and said that he thought Teacher Liu was able to decide on her own. The guy laughingly asked Kang where he was sticking his pig face. He shouted angrily, "How dare he talk about him like that?" Lu Zhuzi shouted loudly that that was enough. Kang pointed his finger at the guy and joyfully shouted to Xiao Ming that he had heard it. Teacher Liu told him to shut his mouth right now. Lu Juxia glared at Kang and shouted loudly that she had told him to close his mouth. She gripped the whip tightly. Kang shouted in fright that he would be silent. The girl walked up to Xiao Ming and said loudly that he had just said that there were 4 weak points of abnormal hyenas. She thought tensely that even most officially recognized warriors did not know about the hyena's 4th vulnerable spot. How did this kid know about it? Xiao Ming smiled and confidently replied that everything was extremely simple. The 4th weak point was located. Suddenly, he stopped when he heard a strange crackling and howling. It turned out to be a hyena that was banging its head against the bars. The monster growled loudly, causing the whole cage to shake. The hyena stared furiously at the backs of the people. Xiao Ming looked at her closely and excitedly thought that there was something wrong with this hyena. She's acting strangely because of this. Something bad can happen. The hyena managed to push the bars apart in different directions, which caused a hole to form in the cage. Lu Juxia turned around and looked at the monster in shock. She wondered what was going on now. The hyena broke the cage and quickly ran at the people. The students began to run away quickly, shouting that the hyena had escaped. They asked the teacher to come to their aid. The hyena ran at Kang, who couldn't move from the shock. He screamed hysterically when he realized that the monster was running at him. He thought in fright that they had arrived. He had to do something. He ran behind Ying and grabbed her shoulders so that she couldn't move away. He shouted loudly that he didn't want to die. The girl looked at him in shock and wondered what was going on. The hyena was already a few centimeters away from Ying. The girl could only look at the monster in surprise. At this time, Kang grabbed his head and crouched down a little so that the hyena would not injure him. Lu Juxia screamed in fright for Ying to leave there. She couldn't help them. There wasn't enough time for her to have a chance to save her. The teacher was also very scared by everything that was happening. The hyena brought Ying closer to his head. The girl could see the monster's sharp teeth, which would be able to tear her apart in a few seconds. She thought it was over. Xiao Ming pushed off the ground and grabbed Ying. He lifted the girl in his arms. The guy hid his eyes under his bangs. The girl screamed in surprise that Xiao Ming was saving her. The guy stretched out his hand to use magic. His eyes lit up with rage and hatred for the hyena. He thought she should die. He touched the area between the hyena's eyes. The monsters screamed loudly and ran back a few meters. Hyena felt the pulses of pain passing through her head. The monster fell to the ground with a loud thud. The hyena has fallen dead. She will not be able to fight and will not hurt anyone. Xiao Ming made sure that nothing bad would happen anymore and put the girl on the ground. Ying couldn't let go of the guy. She was scared, but she was also embarrassed by such closeness. Xiao Ming confidently shouted that the 4th vulnerable spot of the abnormal hyenas was located between their eyes. Xiao Ming asked the headman with a smile that she was fine. The girl let him go and confusedly said that she was fine. She is very grateful to him for saving her. The girl beamed with joy that Xiao Ming had saved her. Ying blushed and thought with a smile that for some reason she felt safe at that moment. Xiao Ming walked up to the hyena's body and thought that the abnormal hyena was one of the weakest beasts of the people's rank. She shouldn't have the strength to destroy the iron cage. The guy continued to argue that something very strange had happened here. He noticed how a red spark flew out from the place where the blow was struck, which flew into the guy. Xiao Ming was shocked to think what was happening now. He saw a blue screen that lit up above his head. It said that the abnormal hyena was destroyed. He received 1 unit of life force. Xiao Ming excitedly thought about what 1 unit of life force meant. The guy touched the screen. His name was written there, as well as the amount of vitality. Xiao Ming smiled and clenched his palm into a fist. He thought that killing abnormal beasts would grant him a boost in vitality. This system is made right for him. The disciples moved away from the shock and approached the battlefield. Someone shouted loudly for everyone to look. The hyena is dead. It is no longer dangerous. The guy shouted loudly that Xiao Ming had killed her with just one punch. Lu Juxia walked up to the hyena's body and touched its head. She thought tensely that with just one blow of his fingers, he had smashed the skull of an abnormal hyena into pieces. Even she is not sure that she could achieve such accuracy and calculation of the impact force. She turned her head and looked at Soi Min, who was staring intently at the hyena's body. Lu Juxia thought intensely that this Xiao Ming was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. A group of students approached her. The guy fearfully asked Teacher Lu that the abnormal hyena had definitely died. They looked very scared that the hyena would attack again. The teacher got up from the ground and confidently replied that yes, they had nothing to fear, she was definitely dead. Lu Juxia made sure that the hyena was really safe. Lu Juxia told her students with a smile that Xiao Ming's disciple had said the right thing recently. The fourth vulnerable spot of the abnormal hyena is really located between the eyes. However, this knowledge belongs to the content of the higher level training course, and it has not yet been taught. The girl patted the guy on the shoulder and loudly told Xiao Ming that he had performed well this time. She will report the incident so that he gets more academic points. Xiao Ming smiled broadly and said that he was grateful for such words. He is really glad that his abilities were appreciated. He is very happy. The students crowded into a bunch and began to whisper that this was not nonsense now. He had not misheard. Lu Blackstockings not only praised him, but also gave him points. The guy asked that the sun had suddenly risen to the west. Some guy, who is called a couch warrior, proudly said, "What's the big deal here?" He was just lucky to find out about the hyena's fourth weak point from somewhere. If he were in his place, he would also be able to. Even Kui Kang got scared and hid behind Qin Ying, and his strength is not even close to Kui Kang. He added that if we talk about Kui Kang, if he's not mistaken, he's constantly trying to get Qin Ying's attention. It seems like his case is hopeless now. The girl looked at Xiao Ming admiringly and shouted that such a cowardly guy could not be relied on, but Xiao Ming was another matter. Kui Kang clenched his hands into fists and angrily shouted that curse. He thought with displeasure that he had now specifically disgraced himself. We need to figure out a way to fix everything, otherwise in Qin Ying's eyes, his image will come to an end. Kui Kang raised his hand up and shouted proudly, who said he was scared. He was looking for a convenient position to attack. He just didn't think Xiao Ming would get ahead of him. The guy came closer to the hyena's body and shouted loudly that their family had managed to raise several of these creatures. He looked at the crowd of students and asked why he wouldn't be afraid. Kui Kang put his foot on the hyena and shouted loudly that even Xiao Ming, a scum whose vitality index is only 10, can do this, and his vitality index is as much as 80 units. So for him to kill this beast is like spitting. The guy asked with a laugh that he now has the conscience to show off. It's just ridiculous. His friend replied that no, after his recent expression, he would not believe it. The girls laughed out loud at Kui Kang's words. Qin Ying exhaled wearily and said irritably that it was not a crime to show off anyway. Let him talk, if you like. Kui Kang jumped up and angrily shouted at the crowd that they were just terrible. How dare they doubt his words? He's going to prove everything now. The students looked at him in surprise. They didn't expect such a reaction from the guy. The guy opened the hyena's mouth and stuck his head in. He grabbed her by the fang and said in a frightened voice that it was just an insignificant abnormal hyena. Why should he be afraid? He stared at her fang, which could easily bite through his head. Qin Ying covered her eyes with her hand so as not to see this horror. She said in shock what he was doing now. The girl buried her nose in her hand and said with disgust that it was such an abomination. Her friend covered her mouth so that no harm would come from this performance. Lu Juxia walked up to Kui Kang and irritably shouted at him to stop messing around. The guy didn't pull out his head. He excitedly shouted to be looked at. He will prove that the abnormal hyena does not frighten him at all. Xiao Ming was the furthest away. But he saw what Kang was doing now. He smiled and thought that this kid was teasing him all the time. He thinks it's time to give him unforgettable memories. He has already come up with a plan for this. Xiao Ming took the small stone in his hand. He threw it and hit it squarely in the hyena's head. Kang did not hold his mouth well, and it closed. The guy's head was clamped between the hyena's jaws. He didn't get hurt because his head was stuck between his teeth. Kang shouted loudly and began waving his arms. The guy shouted loudly that he needed help. Please, someone. The hyena didn't actually die. The teacher has to save him. The guy was so scared that his pants turned yellow. The students looked at him in shock. They couldn't believe that such a thing had actually happened. Someone said loudly that he was really a loser, although it served him right. Lu Juxia agreed with her students. Kang was finally able to break free from the hyena's grip. He sat down on the ground and breathed heavily. He said in a frightened voice that it was a false alarm. Everything was fine. Lu Juxia looked at the guy and buried her nose and rum in her hand. She said with disgust that okay, the incident was over. As for Kang, he should hurry up and clean himself up, and also should change his pants. The guy laughed out loud and shouted that he really did it. The two girls giggled and screamed, just think. This is probably a great precedent in the history of the martial arts academy. Kang covered part of his pants with his hands and quickly ran away screaming. The students laughed after him. She poked at him with her finger until Kang completely disappeared from view. Xiao Ming exhaled and thought with a smile that he hoped the memories of what happened did not overshadow his life. But now no one will laugh at him anymore. Several hours have passed. The students shouted joyfully that the lessons were finally over. The guy told his friends that he was offering to visit Heroes Square. A new-made cafe has opened there. Kang was standing near the walls of the academy. He hid the bouquet behind his back and thought tensely that after the hyena incident, his image in Ying's eyes turned to dust. He must fix everything immediately. A joyful Ying came out of the academy. She was waving her bag and thinking of something good. Kang noticed her and joyfully ran up to her. He called her with a smile. The girl turned to him and asked if he wanted something. Kang bent down and handed her a bouquet of flowers. He excitedly said that he felt guilty about the incident. He asks to accept his apologies. The guy put his hand on his chest and said with a smile that he had heard that a new pastry shop had opened in Heroes Square. How about he treat her to make up for his guilt a little? Ying held out her hands to the guy to put away his bouquet. She awkwardly said that an apology was enough. He doesn't need to spend money on sweets and everything else. Kang confusedly said that he would like to. The girl noticed Xiao Ming walking behind him. She looked at him excitedly and thought that Xiao Ming was here. The girl waved at Kang and shouted that she was asking for forgiveness. He still had things to do. She was saying goodbye to him. The guy looked at her in surprise and asked what it was. The girl quickly ran after Xiao Ming to talk for a while. Ying ran up to him and smilingly told the guy that thank you so much for today. Xiao Ming lowered his eyes and looked at the girl who came up to him. Ying smiled broadly and asked if he had any free time. She had heard that a new pastry shop had opened in Heroes Square. She asks him to let her treat him as a thank you. Xiao Ming sighed and replied uncertainly that he still had things to do. Ying asked with interest what would happen when he was free. The guy scratched his head and excitedly replied that maybe tomorrow. They can then return to this conversation. Kang glared at the guy who disgraced him today, and the girl also wants to spend time with him. He thought irritably that it was because of him that his reputation had come to an end. He squeezed the bouquet with all his might. He glared after the couple and thought that now he still dared to target the girl he likes. He can be sure he won't get away with it. Xiao Ming came to Heroes Square. He stopped in front of the statue and heard someone say that 300 years ago, Lai Wang and Long Quan led a squad of warriors and defeated a fire-feathered bird of the Imperial level, and also destroyed the Flaming Tower, one of the 9 Towers of Darkness. The voice continued to say that they had sown fear in the hearts of the abnormal beasts and stopped their advance. It was only thanks to their feat that humanity managed to overcome the crisis that arose. Xiao Ming looked at the statue carefully. It turned out to be a stone replica of his friends who betrayed him. A voice shouted that Lai Wang and Long Quan are the heroes of humanity. If it weren't for them, they would have been facing extinction long ago. The voice added that it was only a pity that in recent years the great Lai Wang and Long Quan had completely focused on improving without leaving the sacred capital. Now it is rare for anyone to see them in the flesh. Xiao Ming glared at the statue and thought that the vile traitors who had appropriated other people's merits had become heroes for all mankind. What an absurdity! He, Xiao Ming, swears on this very spot. The guy raised his head and angrily thought that one day the day would come when he would tear off their masks and reveal them to the whole world. He will show their true faces. Xiao Ming grabbed his briefcase tighter and turned around. He went about his business. Kang was watching the guy from around the corner with his buddies who looked like bandits. He told them to keep up. They'll start when he's in that alley. Soi Min walked into a narrow alley. He thought tensely that despite the existence of the system, the city is not a place where it is so easy to find and kill abnormal animals. He looked down and noticed 2 different shoes that crossed his path. He looked up and noticed the 2 guys, as well as the monster they were holding out of them. The tall guy shouted with a smile that it was Xiao Ming. He's heard that he thinks a lot of things about himself. He brought out 2 muzzled monsters at once. The boy smiled angrily and said loudly that he was really tired of living, since he was smart enough to go against young Mr. Kang. Xiao Ming sighed in surprise. He looked into the bandits' eyes and asked who they were. The guy really didn't expect that someone would want to attack him. Kang stepped forward and proudly shouted that he was glad to meet Xiao Ming again. He was supposed to eat sweets with Qin Ying. He asked with a laugh how it happened that he was here all alone. Xiao Ming turned towards him. He realized that they had blocked both exits from the alley. The guy asked with displeasure that Kang wanted to run into trouble again. Kang pointed his finger at Xiao Ming and angrily shouted that if it wasn't for him, he would never have disgraced himself today. He won't rest until he teaches him a lesson. Xiao Ming glared at him and asked him what he would teach him a lesson. He really thinks that a bunch of crooks will help him with this. It's just ridiculous. The guy leaned towards him and angrily shouted that this useless man with 10 units of life force had completely lost his way. The bandit was really angered by Xiao Ming's words. Bandits with batons ran at Xiao Ming from all sides. Someone shouted for all his friends to pile on the guy. Let this kid know what happens to those who get involved with the Hyena gang. He ran into it himself. The claims are not against him. He must be preparing to gain an epiphany. They'll break all his bones. Yang shouted happily to Xiao Ming that he was so cool. He has to show what he can do. The guy laughed out loud at his own words. Xiao Ming quickly turned his head and started hitting the bandit one by one. The guys were shouting what was going on. They couldn't understand how an ordinary student could fight like that. Xiao Ming defeated several villains at once. He noticed how red lights burst out of each one and flew into him. The guy with the monsters looked at him in shock. The guy and Kang shouted in shock what had just happened. They were so surprised by everything that was happening that they stuttered when they tried to say something. Xiao Ming adjusted his tie and mockingly told Kang that a nobody like him would have nothing against Xiao Ming. He has already shown it. Kang was covered in sweat and shouted in fright that he was rejoicing early. It's not over yet. He was really scared. He was sure that the bandits would easily deal with him. Kang shouted at the mercenary to let the hyenas off the chain quickly. He'll handle the consequences. He doesn't have to worry. The guy hesitantly replied that it was fine. He gathered his thoughts and let go of the chains, shouting that they say he was able to kill a hyena with his bare hands. He wants to find out if it's a lie or the truth, but he's sure it's a complete lie. The hyenas freed themselves from their muzzles and growled angrily. They rushed at Xiao Ming with a loud squeal. They opened their mouths wide and showed sharp teeth. Kang laughed joyfully and shouted that the worthless hyena that was in the lesson could not be compared to these beasts. They've been through special training, so he's finished. If it has reached where his place is, then it is not too late to kneel down and beg for mercy, and if he decides to resist him, then he should not blame him if he is torn apart. Xiao Ming looked at the hyenas that were getting closer. He stood there and didn't move. The guy was absolutely calm. There was not a drop of worry or fear. Xiao Ming chuckled and said with a smile that no matter what his hyenas were, there was no difference to him. His eyes glowed with rage and a thirst for battle. He ran at the hyenas with great speed. The monsters did not stop, they went on the attack. Xiao Ming jumped up and hit the hyenas between the eyes. The monsters fell to the ground. Xiao Ming defeated the hyenas again. The guy landed on the ground. Kang looked at the defeated hyenas in shock and wondered what had just happened. He defeated them again with one punch. The guy who was controlling the hyenas looked at Xiao Ming in surprise. He thought what kind of nonsense had just happened. Obviously, this kid is not a warrior, as he managed to instantly finish off his most ferocious hyenas. A blue screen appeared on which it was written that the carrier was Xiao Ming. His vitality increased by 2 units. Now he has 13 units. The guy clenched his palm into a fist and happily thought that it was an addition again, a great feeling. Kang looked at Xiao Ming's back in fright and thought that everything was just terrible. This Xiao Ming kid is too strong to handle. He needs to get out of here while he's safe. Suddenly, Xiao Ming appeared behind him. He stared at the guy and angrily said that if he had no more tricks left. So now it's his turn. Kang looked fearfully into Xiao Ming's eyes and told him to wait a bit. They could just talk. The guy really doesn't want to mess with Xiao Ming. Xiao Ming covered his eyes with his bangs and hit Kang between his legs with the words to get him. Kang felt his hair jump apart from his head from the impact. He grabbed the sore spot and jumped high. He was really in a lot of pain, judging by his heart-rending scream. Xiao Ming watched Kang fly away from him. The hyena owner looked at his boss in fright. He was sweating from the stress and excitedly thought it was just shocking. Young Mr. Q was sent flying. Xiao Ming smiled angrily and looked at the guy. He said with a laugh that he had heard they called themselves the Hyena Gang. He thought that he didn't have enough strength right now to kill abnormal beasts outside the city. He did not think that the solution to the problem would come to him by itself. Xiao Ming put his hands in his pockets and stared at the hyena owner. He asked what it meant. There were a lot of abnormal hyenas in their gang's possession, right? The guy replied fearfully that it was true. He gathered his thoughts and shouted tensely for Xiao Ming to listen to him. Their gang is the strongest in the western part of the city, and they have several hundred abnormal hyenas. If he dares to touch him, he will regret it. Xiao Ming slapped him in the face, saying that he was talking too much. The bandit flew away from the guy with a painful cry. Xiao Ming was very annoyed. Xiao Ming looked at the scoundrel who was lying on the ground. He confidently told him to take him to their gang, and if he skipped, he would get even stronger. The bandit clutched his sore cheek and looked at Xiao Ming with tears in his eyes. Xiao Ming grabbed his curls and lifted him up. He bent down to his face and whispered angrily that he would skin him alive. The bandit raised his hands and shouted in fright, which was good. He'll take him where he needs to go. They came to the Western District. It turned out to be an area that consists entirely of high-rise buildings in not very good condition. You can also see a lot of small shops and scattered garbage. Xiao Ming and the bandit were walking down the street. They were constantly being looked at by people who did not inspire confidence. They stopped in front of a tall gate. The scoundrel pointed at them and said in a frightened voice that a hyena gang was running its business here. Xiao Ming slung his briefcase over his shoulder and told the bandit with a smile that he was fine. He can go now. The scoundrel excitedly shouted for him to wait. He was wondering what he was planning to do. Xiao Ming smiled angrily and said that he wanted to have a few words with his boss, and at the same time offer his services in exterminating abnormal hyenas. He went inside and saw two abnormal hyenas fighting among themselves. People shouted to the monsters that they had put the last money on them. The hyena should not let him down. The monster should rip his throat out, or better yet, bite him. The man sat on the sidelines and watched the fight. He asked his subordinate with interest that the third brother had left, taking two hyenas with him where he had gone. The guy leaned towards him and replied that the young master of the Kui family wanted to teach a lesson to a boy, some loser from the martial arts academy named Xiao Ming. The third brother took his men to back him up. The man looked at the battle of hyenas and thoughtfully said that he should take two hyenas with him to deal with one small kid. The actions of the third brother are becoming increasingly unacceptable. Suddenly, Xiao Ming struck the door naked, and it crumbled into splinters. The guys stopped watching the hyena fight and looked at the mysterious man. Someone asked what the deal was. The man got up from his chair and said with displeasure, "What nonsense?" The guy walked to the back of the room and said with a smile that his name was Xiao Ming. He asked where he could find the boss of the hyena gang. He really needed him. The man looked at him intently and said that he was Xiao Ming. He has heard this name somewhere before, but he cannot remember where, although it is definitely something familiar. His assistant pointed at the guy and excitedly shouted that this was the kid that the third brother had gone to teach a lesson to. But why was he here now? The man appreciated the guy and thought that it was him. He couldn't figure out what was going on, but his gaze betrayed that he was very tense and excited about this situation right now. The man leaned against the balcony railing and asked the guy why he was alone here now. He really wants to know where the person who dragged him here is. Xiao Ming smiled broadly and happily said that it looked like he was the boss. The guy looked happy and excited. He had already come up with a plan of action in his head. Xiao Ming smiled angrily and shouted that he only seemed to have misunderstood something. No one brought him. He came here of his own free will, not someone else's. The man looked at him with displeasure and asked that he had come here of his own free will, but he was wondering why. Since he came here himself, he needs something. Xiao Ming stood in front of the hyena cage. The monsters got down on all fours and looked at the guy carefully. The guy pointed his finger at the boss and shouted that he was here to rid them of a hidden threat. He began to approach the bandits with the words that, if he remembers correctly, animal fighting on the territory of the city is illegal. He will get rid of their hyenas and thus help to avoid the threat of arrest. The scoundrel shouted with laughter that he would help them avoid arrest, and who, let him tell him, would dare to meddle in the territory of the gang. His friend shouted that it looked like this guy had come here to get a good fight. The bandits laughed loudly and shouted, "Where did this kid get so much courage?" They heard it. He declared that he would kill all their hyenas. He is very confident in himself. The boss looked at him with displeasure. He shouted to his subordinates that this guy was an imbecile loser. His guys can break his legs, and then they have to kick him out of here. The villains shouted joyfully that it would be done. The guy was definitely tired of living, since he was smart enough to show off on their territory. He had wandered into the wrong place. They grabbed their batons and headed towards Xiao Ming. They raised their weapons high and tried to hit the guy with an evil smile. Xiao Ming stood motionless and waited for the bandits to get closer to him. The bandits shouted at him to get ready to receive a couple of blows. The villains began to beat Xiao Ming with bats. They did it so violently that the dust rose. The boss spoke wearily, and where did this loser come from? So much time to go nowhere. Suddenly, the bandits started flying away from Xiao Ming with a loud shout. The boss stopped when he realized that his subordinates were screaming in pain. He said in surprise what was going on. He noticed his men on the floor, who were moaning in pain. They threw their bats after Xiao Ming hit them. The boss turned around and looked at the guy in shock. He asked what was going on. Xiao Ming looked at him angrily and said with a smile that he had come here to solve their problems. If they couldn't have a good conversation, it means they're going to have a bad one. The guy got into a fighting pose. The bandits looked at Xiao Ming in fright. They did not expect that the guy could fight back. Some guy excitedly shouted that he wasn't imagining it. This kid knocked over so many people with one attack. His friend screamed in shock. How is this even possible? Judging by his uniform, he's just a student. The boss threw a cigar on the ground. He stepped on it furiously and stomped on it. The man glared at Xiao Ming and angrily shouted that he was a good guy. He didn't think that he was only talking a lot. Since he wants to kill their hyenas so badly, he will grant his wish. The boss raised his hands to the top and hysterically shouted for his men to open the bars right away. He orders to release all the hyenas so that the guy can try to cope with them. With a loud bang, the cage door came down. The hyenas have come out of their confinement. The bandits looked at the monsters in fright and shouted that it was a nightmare. They should move away. One-eyed Cade decided to get down to business in earnest. The villains raised their hands in the air and shouted joyfully for the hyenas to eat this guy. They smiled broadly and looked eagerly at Xiao Ming, who has to fight the hyenas. 2 hyenas jumped on the guy. They opened their mouths wide and reached out with their clawed paws. The bandits shouted loudly that the guy would definitely not survive. Xiao Ming calmly said that he would have done so right away. The guy looked at the hyenas and angrily said that this was just not what he needed. Xiao Ming jumped up and hit 2 hyenas at once. He shouted that he had not come here for the sake of 2 insignificant hyenas. The bandits looked shocked at the guy who had so easily dealt with 2 hyenas. Someone shouted that it was simply impossible. He did it with 1 blow. But this kid can't be a real warrior. Red sparks shot out from the hyenas, which crashed into Xiao Ming. One of the villains excitedly shouted that he was afraid, but after that, Cade would never let this kid go. The boss glared at Xiao Ming. He was just furious that he had dealt with his hyenas. The subordinate asked them in fright what to do. The man smiled crazily and hysterically shouted that he was asking him what to do. He orders all the cages to be opened and the hyenas set free. He can't wait to see how many this kid will have time to kill. The bandits looked at their boss tensely, but an order is an order. They ran away shouting that they would do everything. The guys didn't want to argue with the boss. All the cages opened with a terrible sound. Hyenas came out of them and surrounded the guy. The monsters growled and stared at Xiao Ming. They were preparing to attack him. Xiao Ming smiled happily. He looked impatiently at the hyenas and said that now it was at least a little interesting. You can have fun. A minute later, Xiao Ming grabbed a bat and began to quickly deal with the hyenas. He excitedly shouted that he was using a technique to beat up a bunch of dogs. 10 minutes later, he was happily swinging the bat. He enjoyed getting rid of monsters. Xiao Ming hysterically shouted that they deserved to die. Half an hour later, the hyenas no longer wanted to fight Xiao Ming. The guy wanted to continue the fight. He ran after them shouting where they were going. They should stop quickly. The boss looked shocked at Xiao Ming, who had dealt with the hyenas. He wasn't tired at all, but on the contrary, he wanted to continue the battle. The man excitedly wondered how this was possible. Red sparks flew out of all the hyenas and flew into Xiao Ming. A blue screen appeared on which it was written that Xiao Ming's carrier, his life force increased by 86. Now he has 99. The guy happily thought that the feeling of increasing vitality was just great. The bandits moved away from Xiao Ming so that they wouldn't get hurt by him either. They watched as the guy finished off the last monster. The scoundrel screamed in fright that he had single-handedly killed so many hyenas. Xiao Ming turned to the boss and asked with a grin that this was all they were capable of. He straightened his jacket and said with a smile that he had just had time to stretch. The guy beckoned to Cade. Xiao Ming said to listen to him carefully. He asks him to release even more hyenas. The man looked at this strange guy in fright. Cade came to his senses and shouted furiously so that the guy would not rush to rejoice ahead of time. He did not need hyenas to lower him. The boss was furious. The man pointed at Xiao Ming and shouted at his subordinates to grab him. Cade was very angry that his hyenas couldn't handle a simple guy. Xiao Ming looked at him carefully. Cade realized that nothing had happened. The guy was also standing there unharmed. His men did not follow his orders. The boss turned around and angrily shouted what they were doing now, as well as where they were going. The bandits ran away shouting that they were abandoning everything. This guy is not a person at all. None of them can even defeat an ordinary hyena, and he asks them to deal with him. It's just suicide. If he wants to, he can deal with it himself. The bandits ran out over the fence and slammed the door loudly. Cade angrily shouted after them that they were just scoundrels. They ate from his hands every day, and now they dared to betray him. He would find them and do something bad to them. Xiao Ming came up to him from behind and ominously said that it would be better for him to think about his own well-being now. Cade looked back in fright. He didn't expect the guy to be there. The boss jumped away from Xiao Ming and loudly asked what he wanted to do. The guy folded his hand on his chest and looked at him carefully. Cade was too scared of the guy's behavior. Xiao Ming smiled and replied that it was nothing special. He just wants to know where he was able to get these hyenas, and if there are other abnormal animals there, that's all. The guy thought that since he had somehow managed to get hyenas, then of course he could get other types of animals. Cade screamed angrily at him not to even dream about it. We are talking about the foundation by which hyena gangs exist. Even if he decides to kill him, he still won't tell him. Xiao Ming cracked his fingers and looked at the boss with a demonic gaze. He excitedly asked if this was really the case, then he could fulfill his offer. The guy landed a couple of hard punches on Cade. The gang boss grabbed his bruised cheek and said in horror that he was buying abnormal hyenas at the Eclipse Arena in the southern part of the city. Cade said that as far as he knew, they had other, stronger, abnormal beasts. Xiao Ming looked ahead and said that he was talking about the Eclipse Arena. He thought that in his previous life, he had often honed his skills in the Eclipse Arena. If he remembers correctly, to this day, no one has broken his record of a series of victories in the Eclipse Arena. The guy looked at the gang boss excitedly. He asked him with interest when it opens, as well as who manages it. It is important for him to know about this, and as soon as possible. Cade confidently replied that there would be one discovery at the end of this week, and as for the manager, he was not aware either. All he knows is that he's a big shot, and that's it. Xiao Ming patted Cade on the back and said with a smile that it was just a difference. In that case, he would bring him there at the end of the week. The boss tried to get away from his touch. Xiao Ming walked away from him and headed for the exit. Cade abruptly got up from the ground and excitedly asked what he was asking to take him to the arena. He was sure of it. The guy stopped and looked at the boss of the hyena gang. He asked with interest what he was against. Cade looked down, startled, and sighed excitedly. The man said that the Eclipse Arena has a membership system even for him. Xiao Ming hid his eyes under his bangs and said that he had internal injuries in the solar plexus area, the situation with which had been worsening for about 10 years, hadn't it? He believes they were caused by the breathing of a glacier hawk. Shocked, Cade asked how he knew about this. Xiao Ming turned to face him and replied with a smile that not only did he know, but he could also heal his injuries. He thought that this Cade was the local king of Kunhai. It will be much easier if he handles cases on his behalf. The guy pointed at Cade and told him to prepare 3 grams of wood seed ash, 0.5 grams of sand crystals, 6 grams of purple mushroom spore liquid, and he also had to find a clean room for him. Cade looked at him in shock. He hadn't expected such an order. The man excitedly shouted for him to stop and wait a bit. All he listed were the extraordinarily expensive materials used by pharmacists, did he? Cade began to reason that pharmacists were much rarer than warriors. Each of them is an honored guest for any influential organization. Pharmacists are capable of producing damn strong elixirs. Even if he were an ordinary person, taking these elixirs would give him strength comparable to that possessed by warriors. If this kid is a pharmacist, then he should have been a member of the Pharmacists Guild a long time ago. How can he still be a student? Xiao Ming stopped in front of the exit and sternly said that he had a minute to think. If he doesn't decide, it will be bad. The man looked at him in fright. Cade quickly ran away, shouting that it was okay. He would prepare everything. He really didn't want to face Xiao Ming's anger. He had already seen what he could do. The man happily thought that if this guy was really a pharmacist, then he was lucky. With his patronage, he will be able to rise even higher in Kunhen so that his affairs can improve. Xiao Ming and Cade met in a spacious room with a large window. They were facing each other, separated only by a table, and next to it on a bedside table were test tubes with some substances. The boss of the Hyena gang rubbed his hands and shouted joyfully that all the material was here. So, when they get down to business, he was very excited about the upcoming conversation. Xiao Ming took the jar of the substance and looked at it carefully. He said that everything was clear. The guy thought that, having reached the peak of martial arts in his previous life, he had devoted some time to the practice of creating elixirs. He hopes he hasn't lost the skill yet. Xiao Ming hit the table, and all the jars opened and spilled. The guy shouted loudly that the launch was starting. He looked very confident. It was clear that he knew what to do. He created a magic funnel where all the ingredients got into. Xiao Ming raised his hands high and shouted loudly that the formula of the molecular chain reaction was dispersal. Cade watched the guy's actions in shock. He excitedly shouted that he was using a reaction formula. Only pharmacists can know something like that. The man smiled broadly. He laughed and thought enthusiastically that this was how he really got to know the pharmacist. Now he will definitely rise. Xiao Ming created a strange substance and shouted that solidification. Now everything is ready. Cade pointed at the substance with his finger and anxiously asked that this was the medicine that would help him heal his internal injuries. Xiao Ming confidently replied that he was right. The guy stretched to change his muscles. He said that it had been a long time since he had done this. They will consider that the creation of a Class 3 reducing fluid served him as a practice. Shocked, Cade asked what grade 3 it was. He looked at the guy excitedly and thought that the market value of a grade 3 medicine was at least 1,000 gold, and he had created it without straining at all. Xiao Ming pointed a finger at him and sternly told him to open his mouth right away. He figured out the cure by using magic to direct it to Cade. The man hesitantly replied that yes. The medicine flew up to his face and landed squarely in his mouth. Cade quickly swallowed the medicine that should heal him. He felt his body filling with strength. Cade couldn't believe it was all because of the magic elixir. The man looked at his hands, which were covered with blue smoke from the medicine. Cade patted his chest and shouted enthusiastically that it was so amazing. His injuries were completely removed. Xiao Ming watched his joy with a smile. The man knelt in front of Xiao Ming and shouted with a smile that the virtuous master, Cade, owed him an irreplaceable debt. From now on, he will do whatever he says. Even if he asks to jump into the sea of flames, he won't even flinch. Xiao Ming looked away and replied without interest that he thought the sea of flames would be delayed for now. The guy didn't really believe his words, but he didn't need to. The guy turned his back and picked up his bag. He went to the exit saying that he would not forget to take him to the Eclipse Arena at the end of the week. Cade looked at him in surprise. He replied that of course he would do everything. Cade ran after them, asking where the master would go now. The man excitedly said that he was taking him out now. Xiao Ming didn't say anything. A city street filled with various shops. The sellers shouted that beef was being sold here with fervor from the heat. It's delicious and cheap here. A drink on the dried organs of the thunder-horned tiger. Anyone who drinks will immediately understand. Someone shouted that medicinal sugar cane could be purchased. It's big, long, and sweet. The guy went to one of the stalls and took the meat. The girl picked up 2 skewers with meat and shouted that she was selling burning bamboo rat kebabs. 3 yuan for 1 kebab, 10 yuan for 3. She smiled broadly to attract customers. The old man who was sitting next to her called the girl Baby Yu and told her where he was carrying her brother. After all, my studies have been over for a long time, and he's still not here. It's strange. The girl gave 1 kebab to the customer and replied that she did not know. He's probably had a lot of trouble with his studies lately. Maybe that's why he's not here yet. The guy who bought the product from her shouted that there was some kind of blockage. Even he had heard that this kid Xiao Ming's vitality index was only 10 units. He didn't have a chance to become a warrior at all. Xiao Yu works here day after day to pay for his studies at the Martial Arts Academy. Xiao Yu snatched the kebab from his hands. She screamed angrily why he was talking so much nonsense. She refuses to sell her product to him. She really didn't like the guy's words. She looked at him with displeasure so that he would understand how angry she was. The guy put his hands in front of him and awkwardly said that he was joking. Why be so nervous? It's still good. A guy in sunglasses appeared. He looked very proud and arrogant. He grabbed the customer by the head and pushed him away, telling him to get out of here. The girl stared intently at this arrogant guy. She complained about what was going on. It was obvious from the girl's face that she didn't like this situation. The guy raised his glasses and with a sly smile said that it was time for little Yu to pay for the monthly fee for her stall. 2 muscular guys also came with him. Xiao Yu looked at them in shock. She cried out in alarm that they had come again. Since she hasn't paid this month, why are they here again? The customers quickly scattered. They didn't want to get into trouble. The guy smiled and said that monthly payments for retail outlets are charged 3 times. You see, she used to have special conditions because there was hope that her older brother would become a warrior, but it's a pity that he turned out to be worthless, so she owes money. Xiao Yu looked scared as the guy wiped his glasses. She said she didn't have that much money right now. She really asks you to wait for the payment. The guy leaned over to her and said with an evil smile that it wouldn't do. This year, the landowner does not have the opportunity to give someone a break. She should give them the day, though, if she doesn't have the money. He leaned over to Xiao Yu and touched her shoulder. The guy stuck out his tongue and said that he knew other ways of calculating. The girl looked at him with disgust. The man the girl was talking to earlier jumped up from his seat and excitedly shouted to Xiao Yu that if he didn't have money, he could borrow a little. The guy with glasses shouted angrily at him to get out of here. He raised his foot high and kicked the man in the face. Xiao Yu cried out excitedly. She was uncomfortable with everything that was happening. The scoundrel asked with displeasure who was asking him to poke his nose into other people's business. The man fell on the counter with potatoes. His weight broke it, and the man landed on the ground. Xiao Yu shouted worriedly that uncle was hurt. People whispered discontentedly that this was a failure. Again, the scoundrels from the gang of the second dog were mocking someone. Someone asked if no one would ever call them to order. The man replied in frustration that the gang of the second dog was guarded by the largest group in the Western District, the Hyena gang. They, small people, should not incur their wrath in any way. The guy with glasses leaned over to Xiao Yu and grabbed her by the ponytail. With a nasty smile, he told little Yu to be smart and follow him. He asked that if she was with him, he would guarantee that she would live in luxury. It's much better than suffering here, selling kebabs. Xiao Yu freed herself from his arms and turned her back on him. She glared at him furiously and hissed through her teeth that only over her dead body would she go after him. The guy smiled broadly and shouted joyfully that it was up to her to decide, and now the beauty should go with him. He held out his hand to the girl, and Xiao Yu closed her eyes in fear. Suddenly, a skewer flew with great speed. He got into the scoundrel's hand and pinned him to the wall. The guy grabbed his arm and screamed loudly in pain. He did not expect this to happen at all. Xiao Yu excitedly turned around and saw the familiar color of the uniform. Xiao Ming stood in front of her. He bought himself snacks, and when he finished chewing, he said that it looked like he was just in time. The guy with glasses looked at his wound and screamed that it hurt so much. He turned his head and shouted to his subordinates to pull out this nonsense already. They approached their boss. One of them pulled the wand and anxiously said that the boss would be patient. He would pull it out now. The guy said with disgust that she was deeply entrenched. The guy with glasses started crying and said with pain in his voice that it hurt so much. The crowd looked at the guy in surprise. They couldn't believe what they saw. The man excitedly asked what Xiao Ming was. That was his strength. Someone pointed out that he wasn't a weakling. Where suddenly such strength came from? He was told that it was possible that... Xiao Yu walked up to the guy and screamed in fright what he had just done. Xiao Ming waved his hand and said with a smile that she didn't have to thank him. Naturally, as her brother, he would teach a lesson to any scoundrel who dared to offend her. The girl laughed and shouted loudly that he wanted thanks, but he would not wait for them. She calmed down after the incident with those guys who wanted to take the money and hurt her. Xiao Yu started running around the guy and studying him closely. She pulled at his cheeks and asked with interest why he had suddenly become so strong. He became a warrior. After all, it was not for nothing that she worked hard here, earning money for his studies. Xiao Ming pushed her away and shyly spoke to her to moderate her ardor a little. To be honest, he's still not a warrior. The girl looked at him in surprise. Xiao Yu asked in frustration that he had not become a warrior. A guy with glasses came up and shouted furiously that even without becoming a warrior, he dared to do such an audacity. He was just crazy. The guy with glasses bandaged his wound and angrily shouted that he was a terrible guy. Apparently, if he doesn't deal with him properly, he won't understand who he's messing with. Xiao Yu grabbed her brother's hand and screamed in fright. That's not it. Xiao Ming is no match for him now, because he has not yet become a warrior. They need to leave soon. The guy with glasses shouted angrily that he wanted to escape now. He could only do it in his dreams. He orders the brothers to surround this kid and grab him. The muscular guy rushed at Xiao Ming shouting that everything would be done. He and his brother surrounded Xiao Ming, and with him Xiao Yu, who tightened her grip on her brother's arm. The guy with glasses took out his sword and approached Xiao Ming. He asked with an evil smile what he thought now. He seems to be making a fool of himself. They're going to see if he keeps his cool when he makes holes in his body. Xiao Yu stood in front of her brother. With tears in her eyes, she screamed for him to stop. She will go with them, but she begs very much not to touch her brother. The guy with glasses looked at them crazily and shouted in displeasure that it was too late to make such a decision. Apparently, Xiao Ming's action, when he injured his hand, hurt him very much. He raised his hand with the knife on top and joyfully shouted to Xiao Yu that she didn't have to worry. He promises that he will not kill her brother so quickly. The girl looked at the guy in fright. He pushed his glasses down and licked the knife. The guy laughed hysterically and said that he would let him see with his own eyes how they would have fun with her, and then he would let him watch him solve it. Xiao Ming didn't put up with it. He hit the guy in the face with all his might. He screamed loudly in pain and flew away, but because of Xiao Ming's blow, he lost a tooth. He crashed into the table and turned it over. His subordinates were scared and said what had happened. It seems that the boss has problems. Xiao Ming stood in front of Xiao Yu and furiously told the guy that since they dared to lay a hand on his little sister, they were clearly tired of living. The girl watched them fearfully. She anxiously asked if he hadn't said that he hadn't become a warrior yet. Xiao Yu couldn't understand how her brother became such a strong and brave guy, especially if he says he's not a warrior. Xiao Ming smiled awkwardly and replied to his sister that this was indeed the case. Although he lacks quite a bit, the guy tried to explain everything plausibly. Xiao Ming walked up to the girl and stroked her head. He said that he was apologizing to Xiao Yu for putting too much on her. From now on, she can rely on her older brother. Xiao Yu smiled and happily shouted that she was. The bandit sat down on the ground and screamed loudly in pain. He grabbed his sore cheek and screamed that he dared to hit his elegant face. He poked Xiao Ming with his finger and furiously shouted at his subordinates to attack at once. They have to wipe him off the face of the earth. He was just furious with anger. Xiao Ming was surrounded by two men and looked at him angrily. They flexed their arms, showing how strong they were. One of them asked with a grin how he wanted to die. The guy smiled and said that there was a duo of comedians here. Xiao Ming quickly dealt with the bandits. The guy with glasses looked at his defeated subordinates in shock and thought that he had dealt with them in a second. Is this a joke? Xiao Ming flexed his arms and angrily said that now. He looked very annoyed and angry. The guy looked like he really wanted to throw them away. Xiao Ming walked up to the guy who was trying to take his sisters away and said that it was his turn. The guy clutched his sore cheek and looked at Xiao Ming in fright. The scoundrel excitedly spoke so that the kid would not be happy ahead of time. He is protected by the main gang of the Western District, the Hyena Gang. If he dared to go against him, there was no way Cade of the Hyena Gang would let him get away with it. Xiao Yu grabbed her brother's sleeve and screamed in fright that they should not go against the Hyena Gang. The girl understood that they would have even more problems. Xiao Ming and Xiao Yu were surrounded by people. Some guy said that Xiao Yu was completely right. He should just give up on this matter. The Hyena Gang dominates the western area of the city, and people like them should not incur their wrath. Xiao Ming asked in surprise that Cade was his boss. The bandit smiled broadly and happily asked what was wrong. Now he regrets his actions. The guy thought that Xiao Ming would be scared now. The bandit pointed his finger at Xiao Ming and shouted joyfully. He said loudly that it was too late now. He will make sure that he gets what he deserves. Suddenly, Cade appeared and shouted that he wanted to tell Master Xiao Ming something. The man shouted joyfully that there was just a huge variety of drinks and snacks on this street. He bought it for him too. Cade held up a bag of food and a drink. The man excitedly asked that he had made the wrong choice. He can buy something else if he wants to. Xiao Ming looked at him wearily, and Xiao Yu hid behind her brother's back. The guy who molested Xiao Yu pointed at Cade and shouted in shock what the boss was doing here, as well as what kind of nonsense was going on here. He really didn't understand what was going on here. A crowd of people asked in shock that this was Cade. Someone said that this scar was undoubtedly him, but his manner towards Xiao Ming, it felt like he was fawning over him. The man turned to the people and smiled broadly. Cade noticed his subordinate from the lower gang and asked his master Xiao Ming in surprise what was going on here at all. He hadn't expected to see this guy. Xiao Ming pointed at the bandit and complained that one naive simpleton had offended his sister, and he was just about to wipe him off the face of the earth, that's all. Cade rolled up his sleeves and furiously headed at the scoundrel. He shouted angrily that someone had dared to offend Master Xiao Ming's sister. Someone here clearly fancied himself immortal. Master Xiao Ming doesn't have to waste time on him. He will make it so that he will regret that he was born. Xiao Ming looked at him intently and asked what it meant. How? He said loudly that he was just saying that he could be self-willed here thanks to his roof. Cade stopped, startled, and froze. He slowly unwrapped it and excitedly asked what his roof was. The man rushed to Xiao Ming and shouted in fright that he was asking Master Xiao Ming to let him explain everything. The thug who bullied Xiao Ming's sister joyfully ran up to Cade and shouted that he was glad to meet the boss. His name is Chen Ergu from the Second Dog Gang. He gave him a present last winter. Chen grabbed Cade's leg and cried out with tears in his eyes that in recent years he had worked hard to help him manage Lirxing Street. He asks him to give him another chance. In the future, he will double the receipts. Chen was covered in sweat and excitedly thought that everything was bad. How was he supposed to know that this kid was friends with Cade? It seems that in order to survive, he will have to go broke hard, and when it's over, he will cover the losses at the expense of this rabble from Lucin Street. People looked at Chen in fright when they heard his words. The guy excitedly said that they would double it. This means that the fee for their trading places will also increase. Someone tiredly said that he was already barely making ends meet. Some guy looked at Xiao Ming and said that maybe he could ask Xiao Ming to put in a good word for them. He seems to be on good terms with Cade. Chen raised his head and smiled his toothless smile. He laughed and happily asked the boss what he would say to that. The guy has already decided that he will be fine. Cade slapped him across the face with all his might. He shouted furiously that he would say that he was sick of the sight of him. The man was disgusted when he heard all these words. Cade continued to hammer him, shouting that he wanted to double the receipts. He wants him dead. Master Xiao is his benefactor. If he dares to displease him even once more, he will rip his head off. Cade walked up to the crowd and bowed. He said sheepishly that he was sorry that he had scared her. Apparently, he did not strictly guide his subordinate enough. Cade raised his hand above his head and confidently said that as an apology, he, Cade, announces that from now on, there will be no more fees charged from the outlets of Lucin Street. People looked at him in surprise and then shouted joyfully. The guy enthusiastically shouted that there would be no payment for trading places. The other merchant laughed happily and shouted that it was cool. He will finally be able to save up money for marriage. Someone said that it was unlikely that Cade would have been so generous out of the blue. He probably did it out of respect for Xiao Ming. They had underestimated him too much in the past. People shouted at the same time that long life to Xiao Ming, keep it up. Xiao Yu looked at her brother with a smile. She thought enthusiastically, who would have thought that her brother would be so cool? She is very proud of him. He saved her. Cade approached his brother and sister and asked with a sweet smile that Master Xiao was happy with how he handled everything. Xiao Ming replied without emotion that he would go. Xiao Ming and Xiao Yu went home. The guy told Cade goodbye that the time was no earlier. It's time for him to go home. He must not forget that at the end of the week he must take him to the Eclipse Arena. Cade bowed and confidently shouted that he was. The man looked after them and smiled. He happily thought that surely Master Xiao had recognized him now. He did everything to become his subordinate. The Qin family. Xiao Ming's classmate is a very rich girl. She lives in a huge house, and there is a whole fountain in the courtyard. Her parents are not the last people in town. Qin Ying's father asked the girl that he had heard that an abnormal beast class was being held at her academy today. Qin Ying stood in front of her father to talk to him. Qin Zheng, the girl's father, excitedly asked how her impressions were. She wasn't too scared. The man took his daughter's hand and looked at her tenderly. Qin Ying looked away and straightened her hair. She confusedly said that it was the end. No, he doesn't think he underestimates her too much. The girl thought that perhaps it was better to keep silent about the incident with the abnormal hyena that broke out of its cage. Otherwise, he'll really start lecturing him. The girl smiled broadly and happily said that only low-ranked beasts were represented in the class. When he took him to the Eclipse Arena, she had seen much more ferocious specimens. So today's class wouldn't surprise her in any way. Qin Zheng smiled broadly and happily asked if it was true. The man proudly said that their Qin Ying was so good. He looked at her intently, as if he was trying to figure something out. Qin Ying looked at her watch and excitedly shouted that there was still a lot of time. She waved to her father and said that she also planned to visit the Alchemist Guild for educational purposes. She hopes that they will see each other soon. The man sternly told him to appear. Suddenly, a man in a black veil appeared out of nowhere. His face couldn't even be seen. The stranger said he was here. Jang asked with interest what had been found out that caused the abnormal hyena to have a fit of rage. The stranger bowed and replied that he would tell the head everything now. During the investigation, it turned out that an abnormal hyena, who turned out to be in the young lady's class, was injected with a rage reagent. Jang turned around and looked at him in shock. He asked with displeasure what the rage reagent was, who was behind it. The man was really very excited about such information. The stranger bowed and replied that they were looking into everything. Besides, whoever did this intentionally left traces behind. This can be called very suspicious. He raised his head and a piece of his face could be seen. The stranger confidently said that he believed the purpose was to express a threat to the head. Jang slammed his fist on the table loudly. He was not at all pleased with this information. He shouted furiously that they were threatening him. The man couldn't believe it. Jang got up from the sofa and waved at the stranger. He shouted loudly that he should find out everything. Whoever it is, he will make anyone who tries to harm his daughter pay. The stranger replied that he was listening. He quickly disappeared into thin air. Jang was left alone and began to talk about the information he had received. He thought it was a rage reagent. Really? Jang walked over to the window and looked out. He excitedly thought that, really, there was an eclipse arena after all. The man realized that he urgently needed to solve this problem. The next day in the eclipse arena, it turned out to be an old building that was frightening with its symbols and bars. There was a guy in armor standing in front of the monster in the arena. Someone shouted from the arena for the guy to come forward. He must slaughter this disgusting demonic tiger. The monster began to step on the man himself. Now another person shouted for the demonic tiger to tear this loser apart. The knight and the monster stared at each other, each waiting for the moment to attack. The people who were sitting in the stands shouted loudly for them to start the fight. Cade and Xiao Ming sat in chairs and watched the opponents. Xiao Ming looked around and said that this is what the fights in the Eclipse Arena look like now. He didn't expect that there would be so many people here. Cade replied with a smile that it was the weekend after all, so there were quite a lot of people. Nevertheless, ordinary people are not allowed access here. Xiao Ming lowered his eyes and thought that 300 years ago, abnormal beasts were a deadly enemy of humanity, an enemy that, when encountered, had to be destroyed. Now they are used for entertainment. He doesn't even know if the current situation can be considered progress or degradation. The demonic tiger roared loudly and jumped at the man. The knight managed to put up a shield and didn't get any damage because of it, but he was scared enough. The monster hit the shield with its paw, and it crumbled into small pieces. The knight flew into the wall with a loud scream. The demonic tiger proved to be stronger than human protection. The knight fell to the ground completely defeated. The demonic tiger roared proudly as he emerged victorious. The arena workers came and dragged the knight away. Cade handed over the yellow papers and shouted angrily that this was a failure. He lost again, his poor 100 silvers. Xiao Ming stared at the arena for several seconds. He looked at the man and with a sly smile asked what restrictions there were for people who wanted to enter the arena. He really wants to know this information. Cade looked at him in surprise and replied uncertainly that there were none at all. If someone wants to step into the arena, they just do it. These are the rules. Xiao Ming got up from his chair and shouted joyfully that it was just fine. It's time for him to have some fun. He thought with a smile that after killing this demonic tiger, his vitality index would definitely exceed 100. The guy waved at Cade and said he needed his help. 10,000 silver is enough, and he must also bet on his victory. Cade screamed in shock at what he meant. Xiao Ming just jumped down from the stands. Cade shouted in surprise. What is he doing now? Don't. After all, his value as an alchemist. Should he participate in battles with beasts? Qin Ying was watching what was happening in the arena. She was in the VIP box. The girl looked down sadly and said that she had lost 1,000 silver coins again. She threw away the yellow tickets and said in frustration what was wrong with her luck. Qin Zheng said with a smile that it was okay. It's only 1,000 silver coins. The man was with the girl in the VIP box. He was watching everything from his throne. Qin Zheng put the bag on the table and said loudly that there were 100 gold pieces, equivalent to 10,000 silver pieces. She can have as much fun as she likes. Qin Ying picked up the bag and smiled broadly. She happily said that she was very grateful to her father for the gift. She is very pleased with his attention. Qin Zheng raised a mug of tea to his lips and thought with a smile that he had originally planned to come here to investigate that hyena incident. He didn't think that Qin Ying would insist on going with him. I guess I'll have to postpone it until next time. The man said loudly that they say she has recently become quite close with her classmates named Xiao Ming. Qin Ying asked in surprise what. She turned away from her father and blushed. The girl said sheepishly, which was not quite true. He just helped him out earlier, so she tried to talk to him. Qin Zheng smiled and replied that of course, the person who helped her should be thanked. However, he also heard that Xiao Ming's vitality index is only 10 units. It will be quite difficult for him to become a warrior. He thought that Qin Ying was just at the age when the rebellious period was coming. The more pressure you put on her, the more likely rebellious moods will appear, so you need to choose your words properly. Qin Zheng looked at his daughter and said that she was thinking about their family opening a new factory in the southern district of the city. He could have made Xiao Ming her foreman. Being in this position, he will be able to live in prosperity all his life. The girl mumbled something awkwardly. She hadn't expected such an offer. The man put the mug on the table and got up from his seat. He said sternly that in their world the strong devour the weak, and those who do not become warriors have to live without raising their heads. Therefore, they can only leave some people in their memories. Qin Zheng walked up to his daughter and patted her on the head. He said he was thinking of her welfare. The girl didn't really like this conversation, but she didn't say anything. At this time, dissatisfied shouts resounded in the arena. People were throwing yellow tickets and shouting angrily that this terrible tiger had just been taken and defeated very easily. The guy shouted loudly, "What nonsense, this kid is still a student." His friend shouted that he was the new fighter of the Eclipse Arena. He showed himself too harshly. Xiao Ming put his foot on the demonic tiger's body. A blue screen appeared on which it says that the carrier is Xiao Ming. His life force has increased by 10. Now it is 109. He thought with a smile that it was plus 10. Now he's finally become a warrior. Qin Ying noticed him in the arena. She shouted joyfully for her father to look down. Xiao Ming was standing there. He defeated the demonic tiger. It's amazing. Qin Zheng shouted in shock. What a joke. Qin Ying grabbed her father's hand and asked with a smile that the demonic tiger was a military-level beast. Unless the fact that Xiao Ming managed to deal with him proves that he has the strength inherent in warriors. Qin Zheng hesitantly said that probably, most likely, maybe, it looks like yes. Qin Zheng calmed down and excitedly said that nevertheless, the demonic tiger, after all, is only a military level 1 beast, so its strength is equal to the warriors of the very initial stage. In addition, before the fight with Xiao Ming, this tiger had already fought several battles and, for sure, his strength had run out, thanks to which this cunning man was able to win. Qin Ying looked at her father with displeasure and shouted loudly why he was talking about Xiao Ming like that. She was annoyed that her father did not appreciate Xiao Ming's strength. Qin Zheng put his hand on the girl's head and told her to think for herself. Not so long ago, Xiao Ming's vitality index was only 10 units. Is it possible to become a warrior so quickly and defeat a full-fledged military beast of the first category? Therefore, there is clearly something unclean here, because Xiao Ming does not have such outstanding strength. The girl pouted and complained that this was not the case. Qin Ying looked at Xiao Ming, who was still standing in the arena, and said with a smile that she thought Xiao Ming was quite strong. She admires him. The workers of the arena came and dragged away the body of the demonic tiger. Xiao Ming turned to the crowd and asked with a cheeky smile what it was all about. But they didn't have a bigger beast. He never had time to have fun. At that time, the big man was having dinner. He sliced the meat slowly and then swallowed it quickly. The man was only interested in his food. He was sitting all alone. Suddenly, a girl came up to him. She leaned over and said that Mr. Roman 11N, a novice, had just killed a demonic in the arena and now wanted to continue. She thinks he might ruin the whole show. The man looked at her with displeasure and wiped his lips with a napkin. He asked with interest what had become of the last man who had routed in the arena. The woman walked away from Roman 11N and said with a smile that the abnormal beasts had torn him to shreds and the grave would soon be completely overgrown with grass. That's all? Roman 11N raised his glass and asked displeased, "Then what is she waiting for?" He orders her to organize. He hadn't smelled fresh blood for a long time, but he wanted to. The girl bowed and excitedly replied that she was listening. She went to follow the orders of her boss, and she has to do it just perfectly. At this time, Xiao Ming was standing in the center of the arena. Cade shouted joyfully from the podium that Master Xiao was just cool. He admires his skill. Take down a demonic tiger with just a couple of punches. Just think. Xiao Ming walked up to him and held out his hand. He told him to give it to him. Cade looked at him in surprise and asked what he wanted. He doesn't really understand. Xiao Ming snapped his fingers and said that he owed him money. The guy asked if he hadn't told him to bet 10,000 on his victory. He did it. Cade clutched his head and screamed in fright that this was the problem. He was so worried about Master Xiao that he completely forgot about it. He asks for forgiveness. Xiao Ming stretched his arms and angrily asked what he had just said. Cade excitedly shouted that come on to him. He may not be nervous. His subordinate will organize everything. Xiao Ming looked at him with displeasure. Cade ran away in fright, shouting that he would even get 20,000 and put everything on him. He is confident that with his strength he will win next time. The man stopped and wiped the sweat off his face. He exhaled wearily and thought that the atmosphere around him was too frightening. Xiao Ming watched as new monsters appeared in the arena. The guy thought that this was a military abnormal beast of the second category, namely a two-tailed Bengal cat. Qin Jang looked at the arena and said that it was a military-grade level 2 beast. Xiao Ming decided to take the fight anyway. He doesn't care about his own life at all. Qin Ying looked at the guy and confidently said that she still believes in him. The demonic cat jumped on Xiao Ming, but he easily laid her on her back. The girl turned to her father and shouted joyfully that Xiao Ming had won. He had coped. Qin Jang looked at her in shock. He did not expect this from him at all. The man awkwardly said that this Bengal cat was most likely kept locked up for too long, which caused its combat capability to decrease significantly. A demonic buffalo was brought into the arena. He glared at Xiao Ming and kicked the ground a couple of times. The guy looked calm. He didn't doubt himself for a second. Qin Jang looked at him and asked why this kid didn't know when to stop. The man said to persevere like that. This three-eyed war buffalo belongs to the third category of the military level. It is said that with acceleration, it is able to penetrate a steel military transport. Qin Ying mockingly said that he had recently said that Xiao Ming had failed. She looked at her father and asked with interest what happened in the end. Qin Jang looked in front of him and confidently shouted that he couldn't make a mistake twice. Xiao Ming hit the buffalo, and it crashed into a pole. The guy won again. Qin Ying jumped up and laughed happily. She shouted with a smile that this was a blow. Xiao Ming won again. The man shouted in shock that he had knocked down a three-eyed fighting buffalo with one fist. What a joke. Laughing, the girl asked her father what he would say now. Jang awkwardly tried to answer something. He was very confused by everything that was happening. Suddenly, he looked at the arena and excitedly shouted for it to stop. She needs to look down. There was a huge monster standing in front of Xiao Ming. Jang shouted that it was a military abnormal beast of the 6th grade, an iron-armed orangutan. The man asked with displeasure what the organizers were doing. Who would even think of releasing such a beast into the arena? Ying screamed in fright that he was of the 6th grade. The girl grabbed her father's hand and excitedly asked if he could help Xiao Ming in any way. She cried out with tears in her eyes that even official warriors who make sorties outside the city do not dare to provoke animals of such strength once again. Xiao Ming became a warrior quite recently, no doubt. Jang looked at his daughter and said uncertainly that it was difficult. He put his hand on her shoulder and exhaled wearily. He said okay, he would try. The man thought that after all, Xiao Ming had saved his daughter. Besides, he was not at all as bad as the rumors said about him. He has high aspirations, and it would be nice to get his gratitude. Jang shouted to come in here. A maidservant entered the room and asked what orders would be given. She would do whatever Mr. Qin ordered. Jang said that he was asking her to ask manager Roman 11N if it was possible to stop the fight in the arena. The man who is now fighting is his junior, so you need to stop. The girl bowed and replied that 1 minute. The woman poured a drink into Roman 11N's glass and said that she had received a message that Jang wanted to stop the fight. The man who fights in the arena is his youngest. The man took a bite of the chicken. He looked at the girl and asked with displeasure that Jang had come here. Roman 11N wiped his lips and said angrily, "Who is he to tell him? It's unforgivable." Apparently, he never learned his lesson. Apparently, that mad hyena wasn't enough. He stood up from his seat and shouted furiously for her to go to the aviary on the 13th floor and get the traveler frog, and also, when she gave Jang the answer to his request, she should add something else. The girl entered Jang's room. She smiled and said she was sorry, but according to the rules of the Eclipse Arena, the battles that have begun cannot be stopped. The girl adjusted her glasses and said with a smile that besides, they had such a large audience. It won't be good if they find out that Mr. Qin is interfering in the fighting. Jang looked at his daughter and regretfully said that he was sorry to say this, but in this case he was powerless. Ying said fearfully that Xiao Ming would not be able to cope then. The man put his hand on Ying's shoulder and said that he could only rely on himself right now. The girls were not reassured by these words. She was still terrified. The assistant manager approached Jang and said that she wanted to give Mr. Qin a message from the manager Roman 11N. He really wanted him to hear those words. The girl smiled angrily and said that Jang should know that if he rejected the Arden clan's demand once again, then the matter would not be limited to a mad hyena. The man looked at her in shock and thought that she had just said something. That's bad luck, so it's really his doing. He's just a pathetic man, Edward from the Arden clan of the Eclipse Arena. He can expect no mercy from him. Ying grabbed her father's hand and anxiously asked what was wrong with him. She couldn't help but notice how angry her father was right now. The girl didn't want anything to happen to her dad. Jang smiled tensely and replied that everything was fine. He's just a little tired. He offers to return home when they finish watching the fight. The man thought, when they get home, he should immediately strengthen Ying's security. There was no way he could let her get hurt again. At this time, Cade came to place a bet. He was surrounded by his subordinates who shouted that they were asking the boss not to do this. He wants to bet 10,000 on the victory of a human fighter. The guy tried to snatch Cade's ticket with a shout so that the boss would think, "There's no way this kid can handle an iron-armed orangutan." His friend shouted that the boss should understand that this is the last resort. If they lose, they will feed on the Holy Spirit for half a month. Cade shouted with a crazy smile that wealth is achieved at risk. The odds of Master Zio's victory are now 100 to 1 in his favor. If they win, they will roll like cheese in butter. If they lose, they will work hard. Their lives will be determined at this very moment. Cade dropped the yellow ticket into the box labeled man. His subordinates looked at him in horror. They were sure that a human would not be able to defeat such a monster. A crowd of people were whispering about Cade. They said with a smile that the Kadwa Tower was demolished. He really bet on that kid. His defeat is only a matter of time. It's too early to bet on such an event, which is just giving money to the arena. The monster rushed at Xiao Ming. The guy waited for the orangutan to come closer. The monster hit the place where the guy was standing before. Xiao Ming quickly dodged. The orangutan got to the guy and started hitting him quickly with a crazy smile. Xiao Ming jumped away from the monster and quickly stood up. He caught his balance, which was not immediately possible. Xiao Ming wiped the dirt off his face and coughed. He complained that if you don't use combat skills, it will be a little problematic to defeat this monkey. The guy used magic to pull the sword towards him. Xiao Ming looked at the orangutan and said that from the moment he truly became a warrior, he had not yet used them. Xiao Ming grabbed his sword and glared at the monster. He smiled so broadly that you could see his fangs. The guy said that he had an excellent test subject in front of him. The guy from the stands said that this kid had just decided to use a weapon. It's already too late. Even if he had used it from the very beginning, he still had no chance against the iron-armed orangutan. Someone said that he should have left the arena after a recent series of victories. Now he has angered the leaders of the arena, and nothing good will come to him anymore. King Jang put his hand on Qin Ying's shoulder and excitedly said that she didn't need to look. The girl stared at the arena. She didn't want Xiao Ming to get hurt. The man added that he could not win. If he's lucky, there's a chance he'll be able to survive, but he'll be bedridden for the rest of his life. Qin Ying put her knee on the windowsill and shouted furiously that she didn't believe it. She must help Xiao Ming. Qin Jang grabbed Qin Ying's hand in fright. He couldn't let anything happen to her. The man shouted loudly that it was enough. She had to stop. The monster growled loudly and jumped up. Xiao Ming grabbed the sword and charged it with his magic. He got into a fighting position to strike back at the orangutan, who was also going to kill him. The crowd cheered for the monster to kill the man. They wanted the monster to win because everyone bet on the orangutan. Alarmed, Cade thought, come on. He put everything on the boss. He has to push on. Qin Jang put his arm around his daughter's waist to prevent her from jumping down. The girl started crying and shouted loudly that no, don't. She doesn't want Xiao Ming to die. Qin Jang put his hand over Qin Ying's eyes. He regretfully told her not to look. The orangutan lowered his fists, and Xiao Ming shouted loudly that he was calling for the thunder blade to be cut. He hit the monster with all his might. The monster fell into the center of the arena. He lost to Xiao Ming. The crowd shouted in shock that this couldn't be happening. With one blow, he finished off the iron-armed orangutan. I'm really not imagining it. The girl screamed in love that she was asking her mother's permission to marry him. The guy adjusted his glasses and excitedly shouted that it was just amazing. Undoubtedly, this is a powerful warrior who just decided to make himself look like a simpleton. Qin Jang asked in surprise that one attack. How could this be? The girl took her hand away from her eyes and excitedly screamed that one attack. My father should tell me what's wrong with Xiao Ming. The girl ran up to the balcony and looked excitedly at the guy who was standing next to the body of the orangutan. Qin Ying excitedly shouted that he was fine. She was so happy. Qin Ying looked at her father and asked with interest how the iron-armed orangutan died. She really wants to know who came to Xiao Ming's aid. She will thank him. Qin Jang looked at his daughter in shock and said uncertainly that no one helped him. He killed him himself. The man looked like he didn't believe what he was saying. Qin Ying shouted in surprise that a red spark shot out of the orangutan and flew into Xiao Ming. A screen appeared on which it was written that Xiao Ming's carrier life force increased by 124. It became 233 levels. He smiled and thought that these beasts had greatly increased his vitality. It's a pretty good result. Cade and his subordinates happily began waving yellow tickets. The boss shouted with a smile that they were rich thanks to Master Xiao. They raised almost 10 million silver coins, as much as 10 million. Cade and his men started dropping off their tickets. They shouted joyfully that they were rich. Xiao Ming turned away and thought wearily that so many people were watching. Stop embarrassing him. They came to the main hall of the Eclipse Arena. They approached the employee to find out their winnings. Cade gloated over what she was saying. So many people had placed bets, and only he had bet on Xiao Ming. Cade clicked his tongue and said with a smile, which was kind of awkward, although it's not their fault that they didn't believe in Master Xiao. His subordinates looked at the girl with a sly smile. Cade laughed out loud. Xiao Ming lowered his eyes to the floor and said that he had earned a lot this time. These funds will be enough to change living conditions for the better. Now Xiao Yu won't have to strain so much. Qin Ying ran into the hall and quickly went to the guy. She excitedly shouted that Xiao Ming was here. Xiao Ming looked at her in surprise and asked that she was here too. The girl exhaled and smiled broadly. She happily said yes. She was watching his performance. She thinks Xiao Ming is simply amazing. Xiao Ming smiled and replied that he was grateful to her for that. He looked at the girl and excitedly asked why she was silent. Qin Ying blushed and thought confusedly that it was so not clever. What should she do? Qin Zheng shouted to his daughter to hurry up. It's time for them to leave here. The man stood next to his bodyguards and stared at the girl. Qin Ying excitedly shouted that she understood. Xiao Ming watched awkwardly. He didn't know what he needed to say. The girl lowered her head and blushed. She approached Xiao Ming and confusedly said that next month was her 5th birthday. She would like to invite him to a banquet on his occasion. Qin Ying looked into Xiao Ming's eyes and excitedly asked what she could do. Xiao Ming replied amiably that she was hosting a birthday banquet. If there is nothing urgent, he can come. The girl clapped her hands and shouted joyfully that yes. They agreed that he would try to come. Xiao Ming watched Qin Ying with a smile. She was so pleased with the information that he could come. Qin Ying ran away to her father. She was happily humming some song. Xiao Ming looked after her and excitedly thought that this girl had not fallen in love with him. Suddenly, a frog appeared in front of Qin Ying. The girl stopped and looked at her in surprise. She asked with interest what she was doing here. The frog sat down in front of Qin Ying. The girl excitedly asked where this cute frog came from. Xiao Ming looked at the frog and excitedly shouted that it was the same. They're going to have problems. He ran to Qin Ying and grabbed her shoulder. He screamed in fright that she had to. Suddenly, the frog croaked and shone with a green light. He opened the portal that Qin Ying and Xiao Ming got into. They disappeared from the hall. All the people screamed in shock. They saw that there were people in this place. Qin Zheng screamed in fright. Where did his daughter go? Where is she? With a smile, Cade turned to the place where Xiao Ming was supposed to be and joyfully shouted that he had done everything as Master Xiao had asked. He took all the money. He noticed that the guy was nowhere to be found. He started waving his head from side to side to find Master Xiao. Awkwardly, Cade said where he had gone. He had just been here. His subordinates looked around, but did not find Xiao Ming. Suddenly, an urgent message began. It became known that an abnormal animal of the military level, a frog traveler, came from an underground aviary. She can really get in trouble. The message continued. The voice said that this beast is capable of teleporting to a distance of up to 1,000 kilometers. There is a high probability of teleportation outside the city into a high-risk area. They ask all visitors to disperse immediately. They spoke an urgent message once more. Istria continues in the gloomy forest. It turned out to be a dark and dense forest, as well as abandoned houses and cars. Suddenly, a blue portal opened in the forest, which transported people. The portal closed and Xiao Ming, Qin Ying, and the frog that brought them here appeared on the ground. The guy grabbed the frog and squeezed it with all his might. The frog croaked loudly. Xiao Ming shouted angrily where he had teleported them to. Qin Ying coughed from the dust that appeared after their fall. She couldn't understand what had happened. Suddenly, they heard a loud growl. They turned their heads in fright and saw a whole pack of demonic wolves that were not very friendly towards people. Xiao Ming excitedly thought that it was a bad thing. These are military-grade moon wolves. The monsters began to approach Xiao Ming and Qin Ying. The wolves looked very frightening. Xiao Ming clenched his hands into fists and anxiously thought that usually such animals move in packs. It will be difficult to fight with so many monsters. He looked at the trees and thought they were in an unknown forest. Xiao Ming noticed the monsters and thought that there was also a whole pack of moon wolves. Xiao Ming noticed that Qin Ying clung to him and looked at the monsters in fright. The guy thought that he had a defenseless partner with him. It couldn't be worse. The wolves growled and howled. They looked at the people angrily and began to approach them. Xiao Ming grabbed a boulder from the ground to carry out his plan to save his own and others' lives. Xiao Ming stared at the wolves and told Qin Ying to run away as soon as he counted to 3. He won't be able to keep an eye on her during the fight. He turned his head and looked at Qin Ying, who was sitting with her back to him and doing something. The guy shouted in shock, "What is Qin Ying doing now? They actually have problems." Xiao Ming shouted angrily that she could hear him. The wolves ran forward with a loud howl. The guy shouted in displeasure that everything was just a problem. It's too late now. There is no choice anymore. He pushed off the ground and began to kill the wolves quickly. He struck down one after the other with great speed. The monsters didn't have time to do anything to Xiao Ming. He landed on the ground and looked at the wolves that were lying unconscious on the ground. Xiao Ming sternly said that everything was ready. He dealt with the moon wolves. The guy noticed that the wolves were behaving strangely. They looked sad and resentful because they had been beaten. Xiao Ming thought awkwardly that it was strange. It doesn't look like these moon wolves are that aggressive. Qin Ying excitedly asked what Xiao Ming had done. The guy started in surprise and looked at the girl. He awkwardly said that it was nothing like that. Xiao Ming gathered his thoughts and proudly said that a couple of wolves was a mere trifle. There's no need to be surprised. He decided to show off his strength a little. Qin smiled and said with a laugh that Xiao Ming seemed to have misunderstood something. They were not the target of these wolves. The wolves didn't want to hurt them. He was wrong. The girl turned her whole body to Xiao Ming, and the guy noticed 3 cubs in her arms. Qin Ying happily said that the moon wolves wanted to take their children away. The guy looked at the sleeping cubs in surprise and asked in surprise that she had the cubs of the moon wolves in her hands. Xiao Ming did not expect that he could make such a mistake. Qin Ying went to the moon wolves, saying that he had read the research materials on moon wolves and he knew the habits. She put the cubs at the paws of the she-wolf and said that they had been transported to their lair. Most likely, they mistook them for intruders and therefore rushed to protect the cubs. They will return the cubs to them and everything will be fine. The wolves happily began to lick their children. Xiao Ming said that this was it. He thought discontentedly that even so, an abnormal beast was an abnormal beast. They have always been the enemies of humanity. Right now, these moon wolves are completely defenseless. If he decides to deal with them, 10 seconds will be enough for him. Xiao Ming clenched his hands into fists and continued to reason that they were completely different. For humans, a good abnormal beast is a dead abnormal beast. Qin Ying picked up the wolf cub and joyfully shouted to Xiao Ming to see what a cutie he was. She asked enthusiastically that he wanted to hold him. Xiao Ming started waving his arms in fright. The guy excitedly shouted that no, he would probably get by. The girl smiled and came closer to him. Qin Ying shoved the wolf cub into his arms. Xiao Ming grabbed the moon wolf cub and shouted excitedly. He was scared of a little wolf cub, but he would gladly defeat a big wolf. Xiao Ming looked at the sleepy wolf cub. He blushed and said with a big smile that it seemed she was right. The guy was fascinated by the little moon wolf. Xiao Ming looked at Qin Ying, who was playing with the moon wolves. The guy thought that these abnormal beasts had their own feelings. They even have a concept of family. The guy stared at the moon wolf intently and thought intensely that there was no difference between them in this aspect. Demonic beasts aren't that bad. Should he really kill them? The moon wolf brought a trapped hare to his bed. The wolf looked at the guy and growled something. Qin Ying approached the guy and said with a smile that since they had returned the cubs to them, they had now gained favor. Xiao Ming sighed in surprise. Xiao Ming took the hare by the ears and awkwardly said that he was grateful to him for this. He thought confusedly that abnormal beasts were capable of expressing gratitude. They have evolved so much in 300 years. Xiao Ming noticed the grass moving. He sighed in surprise and asked what it was. The guy realized that something was wrong here. He feels great danger. Xiao Ming noticed that a man with a gun was sitting in the bushes. He was aiming at the moon wolves, who were currently resting with their family. This terrible man didn't have a shred of compassion. Xiao Ming shouted in fright for everyone to move away. They need to be careful. The guy did not have time to do anything, as the wolf who brought him the hare was shot. Moonlight fell to the ground. He will never get up again. Qin Ying and Xiao Ming excitedly shouted what had happened. They did not expect an attack at such a moment. Qin Ying reached out to the wolf. She cried out in alarm that this couldn't be happening. Xiao Ming rushed towards the girl, shouting for her to duck. They fell on the grass to avoid the fire. Suddenly, the sounds of gunfire spread from all sides. People were shooting at the ground indiscriminately. They didn't care that anyone could be like that. Their main goal is to get into the moon wolves. Some guy shouted at his friend to shoot more carefully. They can't hook the cubs. The man with the big smile shouted at him not to worry. They will be paid a round sum for the wolf cubs. No one here wants to lose income. The wolves tried to escape from the shelling, but nothing worked. The pack was losing its member one by one. Someone was able to somehow dodge, but it cost a lot of effort. Two wolves rushed at the man with the gun. They wanted to avenge their family, which is being so terribly destroyed. The moon wolves were just furious about what was happening. More people jumped out of the forest. They were carrying long and sharp swords. They ran at the wolves with an evil smile, who just wanted to protect their family. People shouted furiously for them to die. They quickly struck the moon wolves with their swords. The wolves have fallen, but they will remain in this place forever. The man laughingly asked what these pathetic dogs thought of themselves. Qin Ying got up from the grass and clutched her aching head. She turned her head and excitedly asked what happened. The girl and the guy saw through the trees how the defeated wolves were lying on the grass, and small cubs were crawling in the center. They crawled up to the wolf and tried to wake him up. They still did not realize that the moon wolf had fallen asleep forever. The cubs are all alone, but they don't understand it yet. Qin Ying screamed in fright that it was the same. People with guns came out into the clearing. Their boss laughed loudly and shouted joyfully that a good harvest had come out this time. He's talking about the moon cubs. He put his foot on the wolf's body and said with a smile that he was already going to give the order to return. He didn't think they would be so lucky. The guy looked at the cubs that were captured and joyfully shouted that they would skin the adult wolves and sell the cubs. Xiao Ming glared at the people who had done such a thing. Qin Ying started crying and shouted furiously that it was just terrible. They were just scoundrels to do such a thing. The girl wanted to come over to express all her anger and indignation. Xiao Ming grabbed the girl by the shoulders and sternly told her to stop right now. Qin Ming looked at the guy with tears in her eyes and fiercely asked that he did not see what they had done. She couldn't understand how he could be so calm. Xiao Ming lowered his eyes and said uncertainly that humans and abnormal beasts were originally enemies. They didn't do anything that they should be responsible for. Qin Ying looked at him angrily and excitedly said that these moon wolves were friendly to them. She didn't understand why they had to leave everything as it was. Xiao Ming hid his eyes under his bangs and replied that he knew, but they were abnormal beasts, and they were people. The guy couldn't change his worldview as quickly as the girl wants him to. The girl clenched her hands into fists and said uncertainly that she did not know what to do. Qin Ying was very upset that the moon wolves had been defeated in such a way. Xiao Ming grabbed her hand and told her they had to go. The guy led her out of the woods, saying that these people must have been a group. Xiao Ming thought that 300 years ago, the rampage of abnormal beasts knew no bounds. Only by rallying humanity managed to fight back against them. Therefore, if you choose between humans and abnormal beasts, people will always be more important to him. The boss of the poaching gang asked his subordinate that he seemed to have seen 2 more people recently. Where they went. He took off his hat and looked at his employee. The guy pointed his finger at Xiao Ming and Qin Ying and loudly told his boss that they were here. The couple stopped in front of them to talk and explain their situation. Xiao Ming raised his hand and said loudly that they were students of the Martial Arts Academy. Due to unforeseen circumstances, they were brought here. They hoped that they could accompany them to the city. The guy continued to argue that sometimes there should be exceptions. The boss smiled slyly and asked that they were martial arts students. His subordinates looked at the couple with a smile. They already understood what their boss wanted to say. The boss stuck out his tongue and with an evil expression on his face said no, definitely not. Once outside, one of them became a hostage for ransom, and the other became a way to spend time. He pointed his finger at Xiao Ming and Qin Ying and shouted furiously for his men to grab them. He needs them alive. He figured out exactly how to pull it off. Xiao Ming stood in front of the girl. They were surrounded by people who laughed viciously. The guy shouted joyfully that they were lucky. They met such a beauty. They'll be able to have a good time soon. Someone shouted that he liked this cute kid too. Qin Ying then blushed in fear and asked fearfully what they wanted. The girl thought that they would be helped, but they ran into real scoundrels. It's just terrible. Xiao Ming looked at them angrily and sternly said that he did not advise it. The guy thought with displeasure that exceptions happen when people become enemies, and then he destroys them. Some guy raised his gun. He wanted to hit Xiao Ming on the head. The bandit shouted furiously that he had to answer for his words. Who was he pretending to be here? Xiao Ming intercepted the gun. He stared at the bandit and angrily replied that he couldn't help but note that some people are much more disgusting than abnormal beasts. The man screamed in fright that this kid was not that simple. Xiao Ming angrily kicked the guy away along with his weapon. He just couldn't stand this kind of attitude. The man crashed into trees and immediately broke them. The other bandits looked at their friend in shock. They did not expect that the guy would be able to do this to their friend. Xiao Ming looked at the bad guy in surprise and exhaled wearily. He excitedly said that he feels much better now. It's amazing. The guy waved his hand at the bandits to come up to him. Xiao Ming asked with a smile that they could continue. What were they waiting for now? He was ready. The boss shouted furiously that he was a pathetic guy. He was just furious when Xiao Ming sent his subordinate flying. He made him very angry with this. The bandits pointed their guns at Xiao Ming and shouted joyfully that everything would be done. They shot at him, shouting that he had run into trouble specifically. The other villains threw daggers at Xiao Ming. Xiao Ming looked at the bullets that were flying towards him and said with a smile that it was too slow. He understood that he would never be defeated by such means. The guy pushed off the ground and shouted towards the bandits. He shouted that he was summoning the Thunderbolt battle skill. Xiao Ming quickly dealt with the bandits who stood in his way. The boss shouted in shock what was going on here. The man did not expect that this could happen. He was completely confident that his guys could handle an ordinary schoolboy. Xiao Ming stopped in front of the boss and looked at him. The man jerked in surprise. He didn't even understand how Xiao Ming ended up in front of him. Everything happened too fast. Xiao Ming angrily asked why he would attack the students of the academy, being a hunter from Kunhai. The guy was trying to get the truth out of this scoundrel who was doing all these terrible things. The boss shouted furiously at him to go away. The milk on his lips is not dry enough to ask him questions. The man grabbed his hand and squeezed it hard. The bandit shouted angrily for the guy to taste his fiery fist. The man used fire magic. His fist caught fire and he tried to strike Xiao Ming with it. The guy intercepted the burning blow of the bandit. Xiao Ming twisted his arm and complained that by his actions he had violated Article 28, Paragraph 15 of the federal statute. He will deal with him according to the prescribed punishment. He must kill him on the spot. The boss of the gang shouted loudly that his hand. He's in a lot of pain right now. He turned his head towards Xiao Ming and looked fearfully into his eyes. He excitedly shouted for him to stop and not come near him. He doesn't even know who his master is. Xiao Ming didn't care about the words on him. He kicked him in the face with all his might. The guy shouted furiously that his connections would not save him. He will do what he has to do anyway. The bandit fell to the ground with a loud scream. Xiao Ming kicked him in the head again. He wanted to destroy this guy who threatened him and Qin Ying and also tried to intimidate them. Xiao Ming shouted that by going against him. He hit him in the chest with his hand and shouted furiously that he had signed his sentence. Xiao Ming will not leave him unharmed. He must teach him a good lesson. The bandit fell to his knees in front of Xiao Ming's feet. He raised his bruised face and shouted with laughter that Commander Kui would never let him get away with it. He promised it. Xiao Ming kicked him in the head, but it was the last blow of the boss of the group. The guy said angrily that then let him come. He is free at any time. Xiao Ming looked at Qin Ying, who had picked up the cubs, and asked if she was okay. The girl jerked at the unexpected question, but then gathered herself and replied that yes, she was fine. Qin Ying looked at the little moon wolves that had opened their eyes and were trying to find their relatives. The girl excitedly said that they were not all right. She looked Xiao Ming in the eyes and excitedly asked the guy that they could take them with them. The girl said that if you leave them there, they will definitely die. Xiao Ming turned his back on her and replied that it was fine. He's going to inspect the loot for now. This group of hunters should have a lot of equipment that will be useful to them. Xiao Ming walked over to the bandit's body and knelt down. He touched it to find the necessary items. The guy really hoped that he would find something useful. Suddenly, a bag of red crystals fell out of the bandit's pocket. Xiao Ming looked at them in surprise and asked what it was. He should study it carefully. Xiao Ming picked up the crystal and excitedly said that it was a blood crystal. The guy did not expect to see him, especially in such an environment. Qin Ying came up to him with the cubs in her arms and asked with interest what a blood crystal was. She has never heard of such a thing, but she really wants to know. Xiao Ming confidently replied that blood crystals are clots of saturated vital energy. When they solidify, they form a crystalline rock. By absorbing them, warriors can increase their vitality index. The guy clutched the crystal in his hands and thought that he could not have imagined that they would have something like this. It looked like they had met far from a simple group of beast hunters, but it turned out to be just to his advantage. Xiao Ming turned around and shouted loudly to Qin Ying that it was time for them to leave. The smell of blood can attract other animals. The girl ran after him, shouting that it was good. Armed men were walking through the forest. They studied every piece of the forest. They were looking for something carefully. The man was discussing something, but continued to walk forward. The man with the tablet told the commander that, judging by the signal, Group 3 is nearby. However, they still have not found anyone. but they are trying." The commander pointed his finger in the direction and complained that he had already found them. He orders an immediate search of their bodies. They have to find the blood crystals. The men shouted that everything would be done. People scattered around the clearing and began to approach each defeated fighter and examine their pockets to find blood crystals. Kang, who happened to be in the forest, called the commander Uncle Yu and asked when they would start hunting for the star deer. Kang will have a birthday next month. He was going to give her the doe's head as a gift. Kang looked at the clearing and shouted in shock that it was just a nightmare. Where did so many people die from? The commander looked at the guy who was lying on the grass. The subordinate commander shouted loudly that they had not found the crystals. They searched all the guys, but there was nothing, so they decided to report it. The commander stared at the fighter and sternly told young Master Kang that he was asking for forgiveness, but the deer hunt would have to wait. He went on to say that some thief had stolen something that belonged to him. First of all, it is tedious for him to find him. They went on to clear the forest. Crows were circling over the abandoned city. They were looking for food, but it was clear that the city had been abandoned a long time ago. There were abandoned cars everywhere, but not a single person or a hint of him. Xiao Ming and Kang entered the city. The girl anxiously asked what kind of place it was. Where did so many high-rise buildings come from? She had not heard of this place. She raised her head and excitedly said that there are even buildings higher than in Kunhan. Kang followed the guy so as not to get lost and get into trouble. Xiao Ming looked at the buildings and replied that during the old era there was a business center here. Once it shone with luxury and was flooded with streams of people every day. Xiao Ming recalled the days when he was a warrior and fought with his friends before his limit. The guy said that besides, there were no abnormal animals in those days. Kang hurried because Xiao Ming was walking too fast. She asked with interest that it looked like this lane was even closer to the forest. If they want to get out, it would not be better to move to the outside. Xiao Ming replied loudly that they were completely unfamiliar with this forest. If they wander around at random, they will be in danger. It would be better to look for some map preserved from the old days here, and then we will see. The guy thought that besides, it would be more likely to avoid meeting with the comrades of the group he had destroyed. Xiao Ming looked at the cubs with a smile. She happily said that then they should find a parking place where they could safely leave the cubs, then go about their business. Suddenly, they heard the crows cawing. They took off into the sky and quickly began to fly away. They were scared of something, which is why they decided to leave this place. Kang held the cubs tighter and looked at Xiao Ming in fright. The guy excitedly looked ahead and shouted loudly that there was most likely an abnormal beast. The girl asked tensely what they would do. Kang looked very tired from all the events that had happened to her and Xiao Ming, and she also needed to take care of the cubs. Xiao Ming looked ahead and said that they would head there and take a look. They will most likely have to spend the night here today. It would be better to scout the situation around in advance. In the city, a monster and girls stood opposite each other. They were about to start a fight. An atmosphere of combat and anger was flying around them. The girl was holding a spear in her hands, and there was also a bow on her back. The monster turned out to be an abnormal military-level beast, namely the Earth Lizard. He stood on all fours and growled ferociously. The lizard was going to attack the girl. The girl, whose name is Lona, grabbed her spear tighter. She waved them over to summon the monster to her. Lona looked very confident. You'd think she was an experienced fighter. Xiao Ming and Kang hid behind pieces of concrete. Most likely they fell from some building. The guy stared at the monster and the girl and said that it looked like the Earth Lizard had noticed her. Kang looked at the guy and excitedly shouted that she and Xiao Ming should go to her aid. The guy confidently replied that it was good. She can go, and he's here to cheer for her. Ying looked at him in surprise. She awkwardly said that she was very afraid that she would not be able to cope alone. Xiao Ming replied that it was good that she understood this. Xiao Ming looked at Lona, who was still standing in front of the monster. The guy said wearily that they were outside now. It wasn't Kunhai at all. Unnecessary kindness here will only ruin her and him along with her. Qin lowered her gaze and said in frustration that she wasn't sure it was the right thing to do. It was obvious that the girl doubted Xiao Ming's words, but she couldn't handle it alone. Xiao Ming smiled and told Qin Ying that besides, this girl hardly needed their help. The guy understood everything about Lona when he first saw her, so he didn't worry about her. Lona waved her spear and walked towards the lizard with a smile. Qin Ying asked in surprise what he meant. The girl jumped at the monster, but he tried to throw her off with his tail. Lona easily dodged the monster's tail. She took out her bow and arrows and shot at the lizard. She used magic, and therefore her arrows became fiery. They hit the monster exactly. The monster raised its head and screamed loudly. He began to stomp on the asphalt because of what he just broke down. The girl took out a small dagger and rushed at the lizard, shouting that he needed to die. She stabbed him with a dagger, and thus defeated the lizard. Lona got up from the monster's body and wiped the dirt off her face. She shouted joyfully that everything was ready. She climbed on his back and said that the lizard was just huge. How much did he eat? Lona defeated the monster so easily that she can be added to the list of warriors. Qin Ying said in shock that that was it. The girl did not expect that events would develop this way. Xiao Ming stared at Lon. He excitedly thought that such ferocious skills could only be developed countless times in the face of death. Is it possible that this girl? Suddenly, an arrow flew into their hiding place. Qin Ying took her hands off the stone in fright and screamed loudly. Xiao Ming was also shocked. Even he could not have foreseen this. He gathered his thoughts and thought that they had been noticed. Lano pulled the bowstring and sternly asked who they were. She orders us to go out to them now, or she'll shoot. Xiao Ming confidently said that the acuteness of her feelings was far from the level of ordinary people. The guy was watching her closely. He wants to find out more information about the girl. Qin Ying excitedly said that Xiao Ming should give her a chance to finish with the girl. They are both girls, so it will be easier for her to interact with her. That way they can avoid her hostility. Qin Ying handed the cubs over to Xiao Ming. The guy accepted 3 cubs. Now he held them more confidently than the first time. He replied to the girl in surprise that it was good. She could try. Qin Ying came out of hiding and thought with a smile that Xiao Ming had been protecting her up to this point. She wants to be useful too. With the help of her appearance and attractive smile, winning the sympathy of a young girl should not be such a difficult task. She must definitely cope. Qin Ying waved at the girl and shouted with a smile so that her sister would listen to her. There was no need to be nervous. They are not abnormal beasts. They are just people from Kunhai. Lona excitedly shouted that they were people from Kunhai. The girl tensed at this information. She quickly took out her bow and pulled the string. She screamed angrily that she was a threat. Qin Ying started waving her arms in fright. She screamed what happened. The girl excitedly said that she should listen to her. They are people with her. Why is she so afraid of her? Lona shouted in displeasure that she was talking too much. She didn't like it. Qin Ying looked at her awkwardly. She didn't expect the girl to answer her like that. Xiao Ming approached Qin Ying and said that was enough. She shouldn't waste her strength. Most likely, this girl is from the group of abandoned, that's all. Qin Ying asked with interest what kind of things were left behind. Xiao Ming replied that 300 years ago, when the invasion of abnormal beasts began, humanity suffered defeat after defeat at the initial stage. For the sake of preserving human life, humanity has formed a federation. Xiao Ming went on to say that they then built 100 fortified cities under her jurisdiction. It was there that all the survivors rushed. However, for one reason or another, there were also those who did not manage to get to the cities of the Federation in time. The guy said that they felt that they had been abandoned. and began to perceive the people of the Federation as enemies, and declared themselves abandoned. They rallied, once outside the city walls, and survived, all the time being threatened by abnormal beasts. Qin Ying anxiously asked what was going on now. She said that the threat of abnormal beasts was no longer so great. The Federation undoubtedly has the strength and capabilities to help them, which is why they are still ignoring them. Xiao Ming sternly replied that the Federation has only 100 cities at its disposal, and there are no other places that it could provide to people, so it does not do anything. The guy dared the girl, who continued to hold the bow in her hands and was preparing to attack them. Xiao Ming added that besides, they were already used to life outside. Qin Ying replied in frustration that that was it was just terrible. The girls felt very sorry for these people. She looked at the girl and almost cried from the story that Xiao Ming told. Suddenly, a spear was thrown at Qin Ying's feet. The girl jumped up in fright. She didn't expect an attack at this moment. Qin Ying could have been on the spot of the cracked asphalt. Lona screamed furiously for them to get off this land immediately. She won't give them the lizard, it's just hers. She personally defeated him and has no plans to share it with them. Xiao Ming started to approach her. The guy thought that her group should live somewhere nearby. No doubt they know how to get out of here, if we can come to an agreement with them. The guy said loudly that she should not misunderstand them. They're not interested in her lizard. He also wants to say that the blood of the earth lizard got on her face. It contains a highly toxic poison, and she has already been exposed to it. Lona screamed furiously that she didn't believe him. The girl fired magic arrows at them, shouting that her mother had told her that the people of the Federation were total liars. Xiao Ming quickly began to dodge the arrows. He did it very gracefully. The guy smiled angrily and said that he was afraid to tell her, but the arrows alone would not be enough to hook him. Lona shouted with a smile that he was rejoicing early. She stretched out her hand and shouted furiously that she was summoning a tangle of tree ivy. She used magic and ivy began to sprout from the asphalt. Ivy grabbed Xiao Ming's legs. The guy said in surprise what it was. Qin Ying ran to him shouting for him to be careful. She is very worried about him. Lona jumped on the guy with the dagger. She shouted loudly that her name was Lona of the Green Ivy tribe. She will kill the Federation man. She will not give him the lizard. Xiao Ming said without emotion that she was going to fall. The girl fell to the ground unconscious. She finally told him to die and started foaming. This is how the poison that Xiao Ming had previously talked about worked. Qin Ying looked at her in surprise and said what was wrong with her. Xiao Ming awkwardly said that he had told her that she was poisoned. I never really believed him. Qin Ying anxiously asked what was wrong with this girl, if everything was okay. Xiao Ming sat on his knees and examined the Loa. He said that poisoning with the venom of an earth lizard is not such a big deal. Xiao Ming put his hand on the girl's crowbar and said that he would help her neutralize the poison. The guy excitedly thought that at that age she was able to control the wood element. Her talents are at a decent level. Qin Ying asked in surprise that he wanted to neutralize the poison, but where in such a wilderness could they find a cure for her? The guy picked up the Loa dagger she was fighting with. Xiao Ming went somewhere saying that everything is interconnected. There is a toxin in the blood of an earth lizard, but this does not interfere with its existence, but all because there is an appropriate organ in its body that neutralizes the poison. Qin Ying said in surprise that he knew so much. She had read many books, but none of them contained such knowledge, and he knew about it. Xiao Ming pierced the lizard's body and replied to the girl that he just had some experience, that's all. He's just going to help this girl get rid of the poison now. The guy took out some kind of stone and happily said that it was ready. This is the gland of the earth lizard. They neutralize toxins. They will help this girl who is unconscious right now. Xiao Ming got up from his knees and said that now, to reinforce the neutralizing effect, you need to find some purple airy flowers and a green bristle. They quickly found all the ingredients for the medicine and went to create it. Qin Ying excitedly told Xiao Ming that they should not be given to her raw. She was studying ways to process medicines. Maybe he'll let her do it. Xiao Ming did not finish listening to her. He created a magic circle and said loudly that he was calling for the fiery formula of a chain molecular reaction. He mixed all the ingredients with fire magic and created a medicine. Qin Ying shouted in shock what was going on. Xiao Ming has created an antidote that should cure the girl. A drop of medicine landed on his hand. Xiao Ming shouted joyfully that it was great, everything worked out. He looked at Qin Ying and asked excitedly that she had said something. The girl mumbled something awkwardly. She looked at the guy in embarrassment and replied that it was nothing like that. Qin Ying leaned over to the guy and asked with interest where he learned how to create medicines. She excitedly thought that Xiao Ming was too well versed in Pharmacist's techniques. She spent a year studying in this direction, and sometimes she could not build a stable formula for a molecular reaction. Xiao Ming said thoughtfully that he had a couple of books on the subject at home. I learned from them. The guy realized that he couldn't tell Qin Ying his story, so he came up with another one. Xiao Ming went to the girl to help. Qin Ying looked at him and thought discontentedly that he had learned all this just by flipping through books. Such a reason is too improbable. Xiao Ming gave Lona the antidote. The girl opened her eyes and moaned in displeasure. She wasn't feeling very well. Lona asked what she was doing here. She was very weak after the poisoning. She saw Xiao Ming and Qin Ying staring at her. The guy asked that she finally woke up. The girl asked anxiously that she was okay. Lona jumped up in fright and screamed that it was them. Xiao Ming and Qin Ying looked at her in shock. They did not expect such a reaction from a girl who was unconscious a few seconds ago. Suddenly, Lona lost consciousness and looked like she was dying again. Qin Ying asked in surprise why she had blacked out again. Xiao Ming looked at her wearily. Xiao Ming smiled and pointed at the monster. He said that if the girl continued to fake it, he would take the earth lizard for himself and leave her nothing. Lao quickly jumped up and bit into the guy with her teeth. She screamed angrily at him to just try it. He's only his. The guy may not even dream of taking the bones from him. She beat him fairly, and the monster now belongs only to her. Xiao Ming shook his hand in displeasure so that the girl would finally let go of him. He grumbled at her to stop. He doesn't need her lizard. She can stop acting like that. After all, he was the one who neutralized her poisoning. Suddenly, the girl jumped to the ground and looked at her hands in surprise. She excitedly shouted that she really felt better, but how was it possible? Lona grabbed Xiao Ming's hands and shouted with a big smile that he was a respectable Mr. Pharmacist. She did not expect that he would be able to save her from this poisoning. Xiao Ming smiled and said that it was possible to just ignore the venerable one, but he could really be considered a pharmacist. The guy was very amused by the girl's behavior. Qin Ying leaned over to Lao and called her a young lady with a smile. She said they didn't have any bad intentions. They just got lost in the woods. She would be very forgiving to tell them how to get out of here. Lona replied confidently that getting them out is not a problem, but she has a condition. She pointed at Xiao Ming and said that he should first return with her to her tribe. A girl with a reliable idea that if she brings a pharmacist, then mom's illness can recede. Xiao Ming looked at her in surprise and asked with interest what she wanted them to go to her tribe with her. What for? The guy couldn't figure out what she wanted from him. Lao said what she would like. A loud explosion interrupted her words. Qin Ying and Xiao Ming turned around in surprise. They didn't expect anything else to happen. They saw that they were surrounded by armed men. The commander shouted sternly that none of them would go anywhere today. He would definitely take care of it. The man flexed his arms and furiously told the youth to return the blood crystals to him. Then he will give him an easy death. It is a very good gift for such a guy. Xiao Ming looked at him angrily and replied that he could shove his proposal far away. The guy hit the lizard's body and it flew straight at the commander. The commander shouted loudly to his subordinates to open fire. The fighters began shooting at the body of the monster, which was launched at their commander to wound him. Xiao Ming grabbed the lower bow and pulled the string. He stood on the lizard's body so that he would not be hit by bullets. The commander looked at him and shouted in shock what was going on here. Xiao Ming stared at the commander and thought with displeasure that he was afraid, but under such an environment, Loa and Qin Ying should have already been captured. Of those in front of him now, at least one needs to be kept alive. Xiao Ming shot a bow with the words that go ahead. He hit 3 criminals at once. Xiao Ming grabbed the Loa dagger and went to personally fight the humans. He shouted loudly that it was time for them to get down to earth. The fighters fell to the asphalt with a loud scream. Some guy took out a gun and pointed it at Xiao Ming, who began to approach him. Xiao Ming hit him between the legs, knocking the gun out of the fighter's hands. The guy shouted loudly that he should cool his ardor too. Xiao Ming dealt with him with ease. The man felt terrible pain. He fell to the ground and clutched at a sore area of his body. He screamed hysterically that he was in a lot of pain right now. He just couldn't stand it. The lizard's body fell to the ground. It was full of bullet holes fired by the fighters. Xiao Ming stood next to the scoundrel he had hit last and looked at the defeated monster. Xiao Ming grabbed the fighter and held a knife to him. He went out with him to the center and shouted that no one was allowed to move. He wants to blackmail the other fighters with their commander. The remaining fighters excitedly shouted for him to let their commander go. 2 fighters stood behind Qin Ying and Loa so that the girls could not go anywhere. Xiao Ming pressed a knife to the commander's throat and angrily shouted for them to let his men go first. The guy wanted to ensure the safety of the girls who were with him at such a difficult time. The fighter said with an evil smile that it was very funny. He has only 1 hostage, and they've captured 2. Qin Ying and Loa were standing behind the fighter who was talking to their friend. Qin Ying confidently shouted for Xiao Ming to forget about them. Loa looked at the fighter with displeasure and shouted that everything was fine. He can just slaughter this bunch of colonizers. He doesn't have to worry about them. The commander looked at Xiao Ming with a smile and excitedly spoke to the guy to listen to him. He advises him to surrender in a good way, and then they will think about what to do with him. Xiao Ming hit the commander's leg with all his might. The man's legs gave way, and he screamed loudly from the sharp pain. The guy was holding his clothes so that he wouldn't try to break free from his grip. Xiao Ming glared at the commander and told him to let them go immediately, otherwise he would not leave here on his own feet. Xiao Ming promised him that. The commander looked at him angrily and shouted that this was a terrible young man. The man pointed his finger at the girls and shouted at his subordinates to break both his legs. The fighter raised his rifle to use it as a bat. Qin Ying screamed in fright. Xiao Ming held a knife close to the commander's throat and shouted loudly that if she got hurt, their boss would definitely not come out alive. The fighter stopped and looked at his commander in fright. He did not know what he could and should do now. The man shouted furiously that he was taking them to fright. He wouldn't dare put their lives on the line. Xiao Ming brought the dagger even closer to his throat and angrily said that they could check it out. If everything goes against his wishes, then those 2 will lose their lives. He will still be able to escape. The guy smiled and told the commander that he would also die. Xiao Ming looked at the fighters and shouted that in any case he would live. They want to see how it turns out. He doesn't mind. The commander said fearfully that it would be unfair. If he suddenly changes his mind and decides to kill him when they let go of the weapon, he will be the only loser. Xiao Ming angrily asked what else he would bargain with him. He wants to die right now. The commander looked at the guy in fright and said that he did not know. He looked at his subordinates and raised his hands high. He shouted for everyone to let go of their guns right now. The commander decided to save his life. The fighters looked at each other excitedly. They weren't sure what to do. The commander shouted furiously that they were deaf or something. He was not going to die. Suddenly, the ground shook. The stones that were lying on the asphalt began to bounce. The fighters screamed in fright. What was going on here? Did an earthquake happen? A huge monster came out of the ground and roared loudly. He left behind a huge pit. He hit the fighters with his tail, who scattered screaming. Some guy shouted loudly that it was a 9-star military-level beast, the Imperial Fire Lizard. Xiao Ming saw that the monster had also planted the girls. He shouted in fright that Qin Ying was there. The guy almost saved them, but a new danger came when it was not expected. Qin Ying covered her face to avoid hurting herself on the rocks. She anxiously shouted at Xiao Ming not to come near her. The girl didn't want anything to happen to the guy. Xiao Ming pushed away from the commander to jump higher. Xiao Ming stretched out his hand to grab Qin Ying. He was very excited about the girl's fate. The guy grabbed Qin Ying's arm. They were right under the lizard, which continued to swing its tail. She was tapping her paws on the ground, which caused huge holes to form from her paws. Xiao Ming landed on the ground with Qin Ying. The girl looked shocked at the guy who saved her again. She didn't expect Xiao Ming to be able to do this. The guy and the girl noticed how the lizard threw a huge boulder at them. Xiao Ming covered Qin Ying with himself. He thought angrily that things were very bad between them. Something bad was about to happen. Suddenly, Loa ran out in front of them and headed for this boulder. Xiao Ming and Qin Ying looked at her in surprise. They didn't expect Loa to come to their rescue. She used fire magic and hit the stone. It immediately split into several considerable pieces. Lao was able to save Qin Ying and Xiao Ming from certain death. The girl spent a lot of effort and therefore could not leave. She lost consciousness and began to quickly fall to the ground. Xiao Ming excitedly shouted that he would help her now. The guy caught her and looked at her excitedly. He asked in a scared voice that she was okay. Xiao Ming had just helped her recover from the poisoning when the girl put herself in danger again. Loa came to her senses and quickly jumped off the guy's arms. She blushed and pushed him away with her hands. The girl screamed in embarrassment that she was all right. There was no need to worry. Loa turned away from him and blushed even more. She raised her head and proudly said that she was grateful for saving her life. Now they were even. She owed him nothing. The fighters began firing guns at the lizard. They fired dozens of shots, shouting that they had to take down this monster quickly. The guy shouted angrily that they were in a bad way. They cannot cope with such a dangerous and powerful beast. Xiao Ming stood next to Qin Ying and said that ordinary armor-piercing bullets would no longer penetrate the defense of a military-grade 9-star abnormal beast. He's afraid they'll only make him angrier and he'll freak out. The lizard opened its mouth and shot fire. The monster, it turns out, can use magic. He became enraged after the fighters started shooting at him. The monster released fire in their direction. The soldiers shouted in shock what was going on. The fighter ran away shouting that they were in a bad way. They needed to get out of here. The guys began to run in different directions. The fire began to flow to Xiao Ming and the girls who were standing next to him. The guy grabbed his girlfriends and jumped high with them. He understood that they needed to get out of here as soon as possible. Xiao Ming comfortably took Qin Ying and Loa by the waist and confidently shouted that they should immediately retreat from here. They cannot cope with such an enemy. The only way out is to leave here. The guy quickly ran away from the lizard monster. The monster noticed that they wanted to escape from him and quickly went after them. With his big paws and tail, he destroyed everything in his path. Xiao Ming turned his head and shouted angrily, "What's the matter here? Why did this monster chase after them?" The guy began to run faster, but the monster did not want to lag behind and let them go. The guy continued on his way screaming. To cure her poisoning, he used the neutralizing glands of the fire lizard, so his smell comes from her the most. Xiao Ming dodged the lizard's tail and added that it was most likely the cub of that giant. They have big problems, because the monster just won't leave him alone now. Qin Ying screamed in fright that they were in trouble. There was a cliff ahead. They have nowhere to run. Xiao Ming stopped abruptly and shouted in shock. What exactly happened to them? Loa looked at the trees and loudly asked what they should do now. Xiao Ming hid his eyes under his bangs and replied that his death alone would be better than the death of everyone who was here anyway. Qin Ying shouted in surprise what he meant. Loa shouted in displeasure at what he was up to. It's better to die together, you can't die alone. Xiao Ming punched the girl in the stomach and said he was sorry. Loa hissed in pain. She did not expect to be hit, and therefore did not have time to defend against it. The girl thought angrily that they had decided to sacrifice her. Xiao Ming pushed the girl away. Lao fell with the thought that the people from the city really couldn't be trusted. Qin Ying shouted in displeasure at what he was doing. Did he really decide to use Lona as a target for a monster? She can't believe that he could really do such a mean thing. Xiao Ming looked at his hand and saw some of Loa's blood. He clenched his palm into a fist and asked with a smile what she was talking about. She was such a silly girl. It is the glands of the fire lizard contained in the blood that exudes the most dense odor. The guy ran his hand over his face and left 3 red lines. Xiao Ming said loudly that he was now the target of the imperial lizard. Qin Ying tearfully asked what he wanted to do. She begs him to stop. The girl does not even want to imagine that something could happen to Xiao Ming. The guy used magic and directed it at Qin Ying. He pushed her away from him so she wouldn't get hurt. The girl screamed loudly and tried to resist the magic, but nothing worked and she flew away from him to the side. Xiao Ming looked at Loa and Qin Ying, who were sitting under a tree. He pushed them there on purpose so that nothing would happen. The guy told Loa to keep an eye on Qin Ying. Xiao Ming smiled and told Qin Ying and Loa to make sure they survived. The guy really wanted the girls not to get hurt. He would do everything possible for this. The guy pushed off the ground and jumped high. He went to the monster. The lizard reached the cliff, but managed to stop in time and did not fall. The monster turned in the other direction, but its tail grazed a piece of earth and destroyed it. Qin Ying began to cry and held out her hand. She screamed in fright at Xiao Ming not to do this. The girl couldn't believe that Xiao Ming had decided to sacrifice himself. Loa looked at the guy sadly. She excitedly thought that she had only repaid him for saving her, and now she would be indebted to him again. He was a very good man. Xiao Ming jumped off the cliff and began to fall down sharply. He covered his face with his hand to hide it from the burning rays of the scorching sun, which only happens in the morning. He thought excitedly that a fall from such a height, if it did not lead to death, would leave injuries. Xiao Ming looked at the lake he was approaching and began to reason that the only option was to rely on the defensive ability of the massacre that he had mastered in his previous life, and come what may. Xiao Ming closed his eyes and made a special gesture with his fingers. The guy excitedly thought that this body was too weak to fully deploy the spell. He does not know if he will be able to survive. The guy stretched his arms out and created magic circles. He began to draw magic signs. Xiao Ming shouted loudly that he was calling for a dive technique. He created even more magical signs. The guy crashed into the magic symbol and easily punched it. Xiao Ming thought discontentedly that failure, as he thought, this body could barely withstand the activation of the bloodbath ability. Xiao Ming looked down and screamed in fright that, whatever it was, if he landed, it definitely wouldn't be face down. He doesn't want to become a freak, and there are a lot of problems without it. The guy raised his fist next to his head and shouted that he was calling for a dive technique. He used magic and began to summon his various abilities to save himself from falling. Xiao Ming covered his face with his hands and flew through the magic sphere. He was almost at the ground. The guy screamed loudly and began to fall down very quickly, flying through the branches of trees and rocks. Suddenly, huge wings appeared behind Xiao Ming, which shimmered with gold and looked like the wings of a phoenix. He shuddered and shouted that he had succeeded, while simultaneously holding his body above the ground on 2 fingers. Xiao Ming was delighted, but suddenly a panel opened in front of him, which informed him that the life force was minus 101 points and therefore a danger to the life of the owner was detected. It starts the process of self-rescue. After a few seconds, the panel notified Xiao Ming that half of the vitality points had been deducted. The current figure is 102 units. He was taken aback and looked at the panel incredulously, not believing what she had just written. Xiao Ming thought about it and decided that this system has the ability to save itself. He waved to the side and a new panel window opened in front of him. It informed him that the rank was equal to the first. Life force minus 101 units. Bloodbath skill, dive technique. Suddenly, many large stones that were falling from above distracted Xiao Ming from his thoughts and brought him back to reality, forcing him to look up. From there, a huge lizard monster, like a dragon without wings, was sliding down on him from the walls of the canyon. Xiao Ming abruptly rushed up and got out of his trap, which he had fallen into. At the top, he saw buildings that vaguely reminded him of an amusement park that had once been there and was now abandoned. He looked in the direction and saw a large forest. Thinking quickly, he ran into it and tried to hide from his pursuer. After all, he cannot defeat this lizard now, so the best option in his position is to hide in this forest. Xiao Ming opened the panel on the move and saw an offer with a special task, which was supposed to defeat the Imperial Fire lizard that was chasing him. The reward was 300 vitality points. He was surprised to see the reward and the task that the system published for the first time. But now he will have to refuse because this task looks too dangerous for him and can lead to irreparable consequences. Xiao Ming quickly bounced off the tree trunks and ran further into the forest from the lizard. He thought that in the future he would be able to calmly restore vitality by killing small monsters, but now the most important priority for him is survival. Suddenly, the panel notified Xiao Ming that if he did not accept the assignment within 3 minutes, it would be considered an act of cowardice. After the task is automatically cancelled, the entire remaining vitality points will be deducted. He exclaimed, not understanding what had happened, and abruptly stopped in place. Xiao Ming thought that wasn't 0 vitality points equivalent to death here. He gritted his teeth and whispered that he planned not to stand out much. The guy jumped up and ran back, saying that she was forcing him to come back. Xiao Ming thought that if he was going to defeat a superior opponent in the face of this lizard, then there was only one way left. A few seconds later, Xiao Ming reached the lizard and prepared for battle. He thought that the only way was to find the perfect position and deal a fatal blow to his weak spot. The guy realized that any attempts to break through his protection from the scales would only lead to his quick death. The lizard abruptly rushed towards Xiao Ming and tried to attack him, but he easily dodged and began to think over his tactics in this dangerous battle. The huge lizard tried to attack and eat Xiao Ming, but he was able to dodge and use the diving technique. A bright red circle appeared under his foot, which activated his technique. The lizard clenched its jaws and seemed to swallow Xiao Ming, but he abruptly skipped a long distance and was able to escape from this attack by jumping to another part of the lake. The guy, as soon as he landed, jerkily activated the technique and a bright red circle lit up under his feet, which took away 5 units of vitality from him and raised waves on the lake. The lizard was successfully able to get within a short distance of him and launch its new dangerous attack. Xiao Ming smiled and rushed forward, whispering that it was great, the lizard should follow him. As soon as the guy jumped away from the bright red circle, at the same moment, the water completely engulfed the lizard, as if it was smaller than Xiao Ming. He shouted at his enemy to cool down properly. The water began to bubble and boil from the presence of a huge lizard in it. He did not hesitate to use a spell, and with the help of a large column of water from his mouth was able to break out of the trap. The lizard carefully climbed up and came out onto dry land. where Xiao Ming was already waiting for him. He stood on a large Ferris wheel and thought that the fire lizard was covered with a strong hide from head to toe. So the only way to inflict fatal damage to it that would help to defeat it was to pierce the lizard's brain through its nostrils. He tore out one of the beams of the Ferris wheel and looked contemptuously in the direction of the lizard, preparing to continue their battle. The lizard raised its head and stood up, waiting for the action of its opponent. Xiao Ming shouted loudly that he only had one chance. There would be no more like this. He must carry out his plan. Accelerating, the guy jumped up and threw a beam in the direction of the lizard's head. The fire lizard, not noticing the threat, opened its mouth wider and tried to use fire magic to defeat Xiao Ming. But he was at the lizard's nostrils in a flash and drove the beam right into the target. The fire lizard, clearly startled by Xiao Ming's action, roared and tried to throw his attacker off his head. Xiao Ming whispered that he hadn't sunk the beam deep enough. Was the strength of this body not enough? Xiao Ming's enemy abruptly shook his head and the guy could barely hold on to the beam. Regrouping, the lizard jumped up with all its might and headed straight for the ground to pin down its enemy. Xiao Ming grabbed the end of the beam and used his technique, losing some of his life force, to drive the beam deeper into the nostrils of the fire lizard and finally defeat it. The guy used all his strength and with great diligence was able to drive the beam deeper into the nostrils of the fire lizard, shouting for this monster to fall and become defeated in this fight. The fire lizard hit the ground at the same second, pinning Xiao Ming down. The huge tusk drove the guy several meters deep into the ground, slightly injuring him. Xiao Ming, barely breathing, thought that it was too dangerous, he could die. After a couple of seconds, the system on the panel notified him that the special task was completed and the reward would be 300 life force points. Suddenly, scarlet bloody lightning bolts of power began to jump out of Xiao Ming's body, which reached up, causing him to be taken aback by what had happened in the given seconds. He grabbed the place where his heart was and clenched his teeth, feeling a sharp pain there. The system on the panel displayed an alert for Xiao Ming that the amount of vitality received had exceeded the limit, so it was impossible to absorb the remaining 100 points of vitality. Because of this, the vitality index reached the maximum of the first rank of 500 points. Xiao Ming whispered that 500 points of vitality was the ceiling for his body. He staggered and pressed against the stone wall, holding on to the place where his heart was. He still has a lot to do, so he can't stop there. The system on the panel displayed an alert for Xiao Ming that at the moment his body is unable to take in more vitality. Does he wish to carry out the transformation of the physical shell? Xiao Ming was taken aback by such a suggestion and whispered incredulously about the transformation of the physical shell. Raising his hand, he pulled out his finger and pressed the button with the answer yes. The system changed the information on the panel and gave Xiao Ming a new task to transform the physical shell. The main task she brought out was that he would identify the enemy, and after his destruction Xiao Ming would be able to receive the strengthening of his body from his flesh. Completing the task will increase the limit of vitality points for his body. The degree of increase directly depends on the strength of the enemy. Xiao Ming whispered incredulously that it was really that simple. But nevertheless, if he wants to increase his strength as quickly as possible, then he will have to choose a strong opponent. Suddenly, the system pulled him out of his thoughts and issued a warning that if his chosen opponent remained alive within 24 hours, the task would be considered a failure, and the owner would die. Xiao Ming shouted in frustration that the penalty for failing this task was death for his body. It seems that he will have to plan everything very carefully to successfully complete this difficult task. The guy grabbed the place where the heart is again and bent forward a little. He felt a terrible sensation. In order to remove it now, or to alleviate the pain a little, he needs to use the life force to activate the acupuncture points. Xiao Ming went to a cave nearby and sat in the lotus position. He concentrated and was enveloped in flames from all sides, causing him no harm. At the same time, the guy began to waste his life force. At the same time, in another place, a military camp was being built at a rapid pace in the middle of a dense forest. Special equipment erected observation posts, residential buildings, and other structures. The camp itself was fenced off with a long barbed wire that stretched beyond the horizon. Not far from this place, the military, armed with sniper rifles, escorted a convoy of captured people living nearby. One of them shouted ferociously about why they had been captured and why. One of the soldiers put a rifle to his head and asked why they were conducting reconnaissance near the military base. He has to tell me. Suddenly, they were interrupted by a tall, beefy man who asked why they were intimidating civilians so much. His men must put down their weapons now. A beefy man approached one of the prisoners and said that as soon as they were convinced that they were not spies, they would immediately release them all. The main prisoner said that they were not spies, but simply hunted livestock here in the area. The beefy man replied that, of course, he believed that they were not spies, but according to protocol, he would still have to escort all the prisoners for interrogation, and this could take a long time. Pete, that was the name of the pumped-up man, added that if they would do them a little favor, he would guarantee that they would then set them free, as an offer to them. The main prisoner looked at his comrades and replied to Pete that they agreed. What they need from them? Pete replied that there was a mine near them, and they were short-handed right now. All they have to do is go down and get some minerals. The main prisoner raised his bound hands and asked what about the ropes on their hands. Pete laughed and called out to the military, who were nearby, to come here and untie the hands of all the prisoners. Not far from the military camp, several residents from the forest were conducting reconnaissance. The senior scout told his comrade that the hunters from the village had been captured, so he should return and bring help to rescue his comrades. The junior scout said that it was fine, he would fulfill this request. The young man immediately rushed through the branches of the trees to fulfill the request of his father, the senior scout. At the same time, Xiao Ming, he studied the forest and destroyed light monsters. This time, he destroyed a huge overgrown worm. The guy thought that it looked like he should start looking for weapons, because the beam was already completely broken. Xiao Ming easily threw away the remnants of the beam. He thought about it and thought that he still did not know where to go to find an abnormal beast suitable for his level to complete the task. Then he went on, passing a large number of trees. Suddenly, the system appeared and displayed an ad on the panel saying that if you suffer from topographic cretinism and crave strength, then they are ready to provide a search service specifically for him for only 10 points of vitality. Xiao Ming whispered resentfully that he had no problem navigating the terrain. The system ignored the guy's words and asked if it was worth resorting to a search service. He replied that yes, it was worth it. The system accepted the answer and immediately flooded with a bright golden color, creating an unknown creature out of the void. A moment later, a small bird landed on Xiao Ming's head. The guy started and asked what kind of thing was on his head. The little bird did not respond to Xiao Ming's words and pointed its wing to the side. He said that the most suitable opponent was ahead. You need to follow the directions. Xiao Ming incredulously asked if this little chicken was the system that kept notifying him at the wrong time. The little chick did not answer, and the guy said that okay, he would go where the chick was directing him. In another place at this time, the military brought the prisoners to the mine, forcing them to climb down the ropes. Pete shouted at them from above to fill these 2 bags, and they were even. It's nothing complicated. The main prisoner asked that if everything was so simple, then what was stopping them from doing it themselves? The prisoners picked up the bags, and the main prisoner asked his comrades if they could smell blood. It seems that everything is not so simple with this cave. Suddenly, dozens of eyes began to look at the prisoners from the darkness, which forced them to stand in a circle and prepare for defense. They took out their knives and waited. The group of prisoners, not waiting for the attack, decided to go further into the cave, moving further and further. At the same time, at the top, one soldier told Pete that he was very cool, said just a few words, and all the prisoners climbed up there themselves. Pete smiled and replied sarcastically that it was because of the experience. At the same time in the cave, the group of prisoners examined all the walls so as not to get lost, and continued to walk forward with weapons in their hands. The main prisoner was slightly injured and thought that he could not get rid of the strange feeling that something was wrong here. A moment later, after his reflections, one of his comrades received a dangerous blow to the leg, which cut it. The prisoner fell to the floor with a crash and screamed in pain. Holding on to his crippled leg, he gritted his teeth and groaned that his leg was no longer functional. The rest of the prisoners ran up to their comrade and shouted what it was. The wounded prisoner, whose name was Quick, did not answer and just moaned in pain. 1 second later, a large mass of tentacles flew into the entire group of prisoners with lightning speed. She wounded one of the prisoners in the back, attacked the other in the leg, and wounded the main prisoner in the arm. The whole group of prisoners fell to the floor with heart-rending screams, unable to contain the pain. One of the prisoners asked the chief, whose name was Sawyer, what they should do and how to escape. Another prisoner told Sawyer that he should go after the stones and hoped that his comrades would cover his back. They need to collect the right amount and get out of there immediately. Sawyer screamed in fright that they didn't need the stones at all. Couldn't he see what was happening? How is he going to look for them in pitch darkness? And besides, the military deliberately sent all the prisoners to the cave to feed the abnormal beast. The rest of the prisoners were stunned by the words of the chief, but managed to get into a fighting stance. Dozens of tentacles looked down at them, ready to destroy their prey. At the same time on the surface, Xiao Ming continued to explore the forest and look for monsters to improve his rank. Wearily, he said that a whole day had already passed, but he had not found the right goal. Suddenly, the guy noticed a military camp in the distance. Xiao Ming stared disdainfully at the little chicken and said that he was starting to doubt that the chicken was trustworthy. The little chicken jumped up angrily and shouted at Xiao Ming not to dare to call him chicken. He's not a chicken. The guy inquiringly asked about who he really was then. Their small quarrel was interrupted by the system, which displayed a message on the main panel that the space scan was completed. A suitable target had been detected. Therefore, the action of the search service is completed. The system immediately closed the panel, causing Xiao Ming to fall into a stupor. The guy, annoyed, shouted for her to indicate at least a more accurate position. The little chicken turned away from Xiao Ming resentfully, showing that he would not help him. Xiao Ming thought about it and whispered that a suitable target was located on the territory of the military camp. Is it possible that a strong abnormal beast is being kept in this camp? Is this possible? The military camp was filled with various equipment for the military, who at that time were laughing all over the neighborhood. One of them looked down and shouted that what they were waiting for had begun. At the very bottom, Sawyer, holding a badly wounded comrade in his arms, shouted that in this pitch darkness they would never be able to defeat this monster. They were trapped. They need to get out as soon as possible. As if playing with them, the monster opened its huge mouth and with the help of air sucked in Quick, who was not restrained by Sawyer. He rushed to him and shouted to his comrades that he would help him, and the two of them should move back to the exit from this trap. At the same moment, the tentacles grabbed and engulfed both of his companions. Sawyer heard the sound of iron falling on stone and stopped. He didn't see his companions and shouted the names of Joey and Ron. Xiao Ming was developing his own plan. He realized that the abnormal beast was most likely in an underground cave, and it looks like these military are using captured people as food for him. The military stood in front of the descent into the cave to the abnormal beast and laughed, shouting that judging by the sound that comes from the depths of the cave, someone has already been caught. One of the military offered to bet on how many minutes the prey of the abnormal beast would last this time. Another soldier turned to Pete and asked why they were catching people at all and letting them feed that abnormal beast. Pete coldly replied that he was new. Yes. Had he ever heard of the Alchemist Guild? The soldier replied that he had heard. As far as he knows, this is an organization that collects various materials to create potions and elixirs. Pete put his hand on the military man's shoulder and replied that any pharmacist could create drugs. Things are not so simple with the Alchemist Guild in this matter. They are also a squad subordinate to the Alchemist Guild, and therefore they have to do everything that can bring in big money. Pete smiled like a maniac and said that what promises a lot of money are blood crystals. With a light movement of his hand, he took one of these crystals out of his hand and showed it to the military man. The military began to ask Pete questions. After all, blood crystals are not a rare material that occasionally falls from high-level animals. It looks like they can be created. Pete replied that yes, that's right. Due to the extraordinary difficulty of mining, blood crystals are extremely valuable to all members of the Alchemist Guild. However, Night Raven, a high-ranking member of the Alchemist Guild, has developed a way to create them, and the necessary raw materials for production are human blood and flesh. One of the soldiers asked if his words meant that they could produce blood crystals in mass quantities. Pete smiled broadly and laughed. He said that if only everything was as simple as they say, this still requires. Suddenly, one of the soldiers was struck by an unknown arrow. He fell before he could recover. Due to the inertia of the arrow, the military man's body fell into the cave to the abnormal beast. Pete shouted for everyone to lie down. They were attacked. A huge swarm of arrows rained down on all the soldiers who were in the camp. Pete shouted at the top of his voice for them to return fire. There was a roar of machine gun fire, which was directed towards the attacking intruders. The military tried to break through their fortifications captured by the enemies, but they were too strong to be destroyed so easily. The leader of the attackers jumped out of his hiding place, pulled the bowstring, and shot exactly at one military man, killing him completely. Xiao Ming, looking at this fight, whispered that the shooting technique of these people was at a decent level, but he clearly could not cope alone against an entire camp. Pete roared and picked up a minigun, which he began to fire at his enemy. He shouted to his subordinates to surround him. He was just the one here. The military began to send a hail of fire bullets precisely into the shelter of their enemy, which was represented by their armored car. Suddenly, a tornado of arrows flew into a part of the military, which struck them down. Pete shouted that reinforcements had approached the enemy. They needed to regroup to repel a new wave of attacks. But a dense wall of arrows prevented him from approaching his subordinates, and Pete jumped aside to escape from imminent death. A large number of archers jumped out from behind the fortifications and went to finish off the surviving military. Xiao Ming, who was watching this situation, noticed that Lona, his friend and girlfriend, were among the attackers. Why is she here? Are these people her relatives? But then what about Qin Ying? The military reinforcements were very quickly captured by large tree roots, depriving them of the ability to defend themselves. The leader of the attackers pulled the bowstring and fired a fiery arrow into the fuel barrels, which instantly exploded and destroyed all the military reinforcements. Suddenly, a large robot came out of one of the hangars and stood in front of the attackers. Pete was sitting in the control cabin of the robot, who directed the mechanical arm of his unit in their direction. He shouted that they were a bunch of lousy rats, so it was time for him to put them in their place. Pete clamped down on the trigger hook and flames poured out of the mechanical arm, which destroyed and scattered the attackers standing in relative proximity to the robot in different directions. Lona quickly ran closer and clapped her hands to use her tree ivy braiding technique. A lot of ivy and bright blue flames began to appear around her legs. Pete's robot was immediately completely captured by the ivy, which prevented him from taking a single step. Lona's relatives shouted that the iron machine was immobilized, so they needed to fire at it with bows. The volley of arrows from the bows had no effect or malfunction on Pete's robot. Pete shouted joyfully from the cockpit that they were a bunch of fools if they thought they could pierce the cockpit of the mecha with their arrows. The robot's skin doesn't care about these attacks, they are useless. Did they really think they could pin him down with such a small thing? Pete immediately became stern and with light movements relieved his robot of the ivy. He immediately went to carry out his attack and shouted that it was time for them to know the full power of civilization. They have to go to hell. A fiery hail of bullets flew from all the barrels of the robot towards the attackers, which swept away the fortifications and people hiding behind them. Relatives of Lona. She shouted in shock that how could it have come to this? Lona jumped out from behind the fortifications and shouted that she would destroy Pete's robot herself, taking a spear in her hands. Suddenly, a hand appeared on her shoulder and her owner asked her to give up this role to him. Lona looked at the guy in surprise and recognized him as Xiao Ming. He snatched the spear from her and walked straight at Pete's robot. The guy jerked at him and swung for his attack. Pete noticed Xiao Ming and shouted out that another volunteer for the role of cannon fodder dared to act against him himself. Then he will turn it into a sieve. Fire bullets were shooting out of the robot's cannons at high speed, but Xiao Ming easily dodged all of them. Pete clenched his teeth in surprise and whispered that this speed was too high. Was a warrior fighting against him? Lona's relatives shouted that help had come to them, but it was unknown where it came from. But anyway, thanks to him, they had a great chance to attack. The head of the attackers thought that if ordinary attacks do not penetrate it, then you need to try to strengthen the arrow with an air element. He pulled the bowstring and fired a heavy arrow towards the robot. She flew into the armored glass of the robot with lightning speed and wedged right into it. Pete shouted out in shock that this was impossible, because he almost pierced the armored one with an arrow. Pete got too angry and shouted that he was tired of their attacks, so he had to destroy his enemies as quickly as possible. At the same time, Xiao Ming got too close to the robot and swung his spear using a diving technique. The guy jumped away from the fire seal and shouted that someone who is distracted in the middle of a fight by all sorts of nonsense does not live long. He raised the spear above his head and with a quick attack pierced the armored glass of the robot, fatally wounding Pete in the process. Pete sighed heavily and tried to get up, but the robot sparked and immediately exploded. Lona's relatives began shouting that Xiao Ming had done a great job because they were able to defeat the military. Lona ran up to Xiao Ming and said that he had done incredible things. When the guy jumped off the cliff, she did not think that she would be able to meet him again. The head of the tribe told Xiao Ming that he was grateful for the help. Their entire tribe was now in his debt. Lona interrupted her father and said that this guy's name was Xiao Ming, and he was the man who saved her from the lizard. The head of the tribe said that it meant that Xiao Ming was the one who saved his daughter. He has already helped them twice, and therefore he really does not know how to thank him. If Xiao Ming needs help from the abandoned, then he can speak boldly. Xiao Ming replied to him that it was nothing, and he should not attach importance to it. In addition, he asked if they knew where the underground cave was located in this camp. The head of the tribe pointed his finger at the end of the military camp and said that she was there. They're here because of her, too. Their relatives who were captured are there. Xiao Ming and the others came to the cave. The guy said that according to his assumptions, the military used this cave to keep an abnormal beast there and send people to feed it. Therefore, it is quite dangerous down there, and only he should go down. The head of the tribe excitedly replied that it was their own problem. They can't force him to risk his life again. Xiao Ming replied that in that case, someone from his tribe had experience fighting abnormal beasts in the dark. The people from the tribe hesitated and did not answer. The head of the tribe said that abnormal animals are extremely ferocious creatures, so even if you meet them in the daytime, you must be extremely careful, not to mention the darkness where they usually live. Therefore, they usually avoid fighting them in conditions of limited visibility. Xiao Ming replied that there was not only limited visibility in that tunnel, but also a cramped space, which was extremely unfavorable for a large number of people to fight. Besides, the beast below them is far from simple, so they should let it go down. The head of the tribe tried to object, but Xiao Ming stopped him and said that if he was so worried, he would not refuse if the head lent him his sword. Xiao Ming went deep into the cave and lit a torch to light his way. He whispered that he had not held a sword in his hands for a long time. As soon as he takes it up, the memories of his time spent in the Temple of the Sacred Sword immediately pop up. He remembered that it was in the Temple of the Sacred Sword that the three of them swore that they would remain faithful companions for the rest of their lives. But his memories were interrupted by a tentacle that wanted to swallow Xiao Ming. But he easily deflected the blow and destroyed the tentacle with one blow. The guy gritted his teeth and whispered that he would never let them live in peace after the betrayal. He should become much stronger than he is at the moment. The system displayed a summary of the defeated opponent on the panel. The sandworm, a gregarious creature that lives mostly underground, has a craving for the smell of blood. Survives through surprise attacks. Physical strength is at the peak of the military level. Xiao Ming went down to the defeated beast and whispered that this beast could not be considered strong in any way. Why did the system bring him here? Because he didn't see any more abnormal beasts. He thought that perhaps a powerful abnormal beast was in the depths of the cave. As he walked on and stepped over the bodies of the abnormal beasts, Xiao Ming continued to think that even without taking into account their number, their size was also beyond the norm. The situation with the people who descended into this cave clearly leaves much to be desired. Xiao Ming continued to walk deeper into the cave. As out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a human hand in the bodies of the destroyed abnormal beasts. He shouted that he would take him out now, because his tribesmen had come to graze him. They're at the exit now, and he's going to get him to them right away. The mortally wounded Sawyer raised his hand and pointed forward, saying that there was an iron door, and he also wants Xiao Ming to inform his relatives so that they will avenge him. Xiao Ming laid Sawyer's dead body on the ground and went to the iron door that Sawyer was pointing at. He hit the door with all his might, and from a small window, the military asked him for the password. The guy replied that he would be destroyed. The military man shouted for Xiao Ming to leave, otherwise he would see how he would show off when he was being eaten by sandworms. The military man closed the window with all his might. Xiao Ming, unable to stand such an act, kicked the door with all his might. He began to deliver consecutive blows, which caused the military to shout at him that he really thought he could break through a thick iron door. After a prolonged series of blows, the ceiling that held the door began to crumble, and the door clattered down on the soldier behind it. Xiao Ming went inside and looked at the corridor going to his right. The system immediately displayed a warning on the panel that a suitable target had been spotted ahead. Xiao Ming thought that this was probably where the target abnormal beast was located. He continued walking down the corridor, which was covered in blood, and was ready to fight the abnormal beast. The guy entered the next door and saw a large number of water tanks in which sandworms were growing. He realized that this is where they are grown. Terrible creatures capable of destroying people were peacefully grown in their tanks. Xiao Ming whispered that he did not feel the presence of people, and even the auras of animals were missing. Suddenly, he was interrupted by an unknown voice saying that he was saying not to be disturbed during the experiments. Xiao Ming felt an unknown person appear behind him, who shouted why his words were being ignored again. The guy felt a sharp pain in his arm from an unknown blood-scarlet sword. The man in the raven mask tried to strike a second blow, but Xiao Ming successfully dodged it. He thought he hadn't even caught a glimpse of his presence. This man is not as simple as it seems at first glance. Xiao Ming tried to pull the blade out of his hand, but his palm went through it as if it wasn't there. The guy asked uncertainly if it was really a phantom. How strange. The system notified Xiao Ming that the target had been detected. Night Raven, a warrior of the second rank. The profession is an alchemist. The limit of vitality is 1,000 points out of 1,000 possible. Xiao Ming hesitantly whispered that as the target of the task turned out to be a human, shouldn't there be a high-ranking abnormal beast? The Night Raven shouted to him that he was no match for him and how Xiao Ming had entered here. The guy smiled and sarcastically replied that he had entered here with his feet. The Night Raven suddenly looked at Xiao Ming's sword and saw the blood of the sandworms he was cultivating. The Night Raven screamed hysterically that he had killed his precious sandworms. How could he do that? These were his precious worms, his blood crystals. Xiao Ming at least knows how many people he had to feed to the sandworms to make them grow so big. He's a complete bastard. It's a complete waste. Xiao Ming thought that the Night Raven's head might not be alright, but its strength is really great. Besides, there is one oddity. For some reason, the aura of an abnormal beast emanates from it, but it shouldn't be like that. Is he really the target of a task from the system? The Night Raven shouted that he did not like to kill for nothing, because this only leads to a senseless waste of resources. But Xiao Ming managed to anger him. He not only wasted the results of the work of a huge number of people, but also his mental strength, which he put into his work. He has committed shameful waste, so he must disappear. He shouted the words absolute darkness and his technique immediately activated, blinding Xiao Ming. The guy thought that this was a combat skill over an area that completely made it impossible to see. In addition, the most problematic thing in battles with warriors of superior rank is their combat skills. The Night Raven, taking advantage of his opponent's temporary blindness, quickly moved behind him and tried to hit Xiao Ming with a blade, but he successfully parried the preparing attack from his enemy. The guy realized that in the area of action of his skill, the Night Raven can dispel aura and sounds. He swung and deflected the next attack attempt from his enemy with his blow. But the Night Raven was easily able to hit Xiao Ming a second time by stabbing a phantom dagger into his back. He said that the two blades had already reached the target, and when the count reached 12, his death would be inevitable. Xiao Ming stood in an expectant stance and thought that there was really something wrong with the stiletto shadows in him. He can't be exposed anymore. This area of control turned out to be too problematic. He grabbed his left hand, which had a phantom stiletto in it, and whispered that he couldn't go on like this. He urgently needs to calm down and put his thoughts in order. The system opened the panel again and displayed a reminder that after marking the target, the marked target will be fixed in its field of view. Xiao Ming shouted a dissatisfied question about whether it was possible to tell about this earlier. The system displayed a new warning on the panel and notified Xiao Ming that when the target was marked, he would have only 24 hours to eliminate it. In the event that he fails to meet the deadline, the task will fail, which will lead to his death. The Night Raven reappeared behind Xiao Ming and attacked him with its blade, hitting its enemy again. Xiao Ming was annoyed to think that today he would perceive the Night Raven as an abnormal beast. He raised his sword and swung at his enemy, saying that either he or his enemy would win. Xiao Ming shouted for the sword to mark the Night Raven. The big mouth of the bear headed towards Xiao Ming's enemy. Xiao Ming released a lump of energy with the mouth of a big bear from his sword. She easily overcame the path and stabbed right into the center of the Night Raven's chest. He staggered from a strange feeling and wondered what it was. How did he get a tremor in his back if he didn't take any damage from Xiao Ming, his opponent? The Night Raven spun around and found himself behind his opponent. He shouted that he would destroy and cut Xiao Ming into shreds and feed him to sandworms. He struck in such a way that it seemed Xiao Ming had no chance to dodge, but he was able to do so and carry out his attack on the Night Raven. He easily dodged and ended up behind the guy. The Night Raven shouted that Xiao Ming knew where he was. It was impossible. The guy smiled broadly and replied that he had met many people like him. Cowards who could only stab their enemies in the back from the shadows. The Night Raven smiled maliciously and said that it was really interesting, because a warrior of the first rank who turned out to be so arrogant by himself and did not feel even a drop of fear in front of him. Xiao Ming is a very valuable material for experiments in his laboratory. He raised his head and said that he needed to think a little. Suddenly, he snapped 2 of his fingers and said that he had come up with a very good idea. Xiao Ming must bow to the Night Raven 3 times, recognize him as a teacher, and then he will not kill him. Moreover, he will give him the opportunity to get rich with him. Xiao Ming smiled broadly and told the Night Raven to bow to him 3 times, and he promised that his death would be very quick. What can the Night Raven say to this sentence? The Night Raven smiled ominously and said that it was very interesting. He scattered his technique and said that he had never played with a toy that had not shown him a drop of fear. He would try his best not to kill Xiao Ming. He should hold out as long as possible so that this does not happen. He shouted that they needed to continue, and he really wanted to see how much red there was inside Xiao Ming. The Night Raven jumped out with a jerk and attacked his opponent, but Xiao Ming managed to dodge this attack. The Night Raven began to launch a series of attacks, which were barely parried by Xiao Ming. He thought that this guy had a very honed fencing technique, and even though his strength and speed were inferior to his performance, however, this annoying man gave the impression of a battle-hardened veteran. This is evidenced by the fact that he managed to anticipate all the attacks of the Night Raven. Xiao Ming continued to repel his opponent's attacks, and Night Raven did not think for long how exactly a warrior of the 1st rank could possess such skill. It's impossible. The guy saw that the Night Raven hesitated and carried out his striking attack, seriously wounding his enemy, who dropped his blade from his hands and fell to the floor of his laboratory. Xiao Ming's punch hit exactly on target, destroying part of the Night Raven mask and slightly injuring his body and limbs. The Night Raven, in a shocked state, asked that Xiao Ming suddenly matched his speed. How is this possible? Because he was weaker and slower just a couple of seconds ago. At some point, he began to feel the terrifying pressure coming from this guy he was fighting. Can he really have the energy of mental suppression? Xiao Ming is a warrior of the 1st rank. Such a thing is simply impossible. Xiao Ming looked at the Night Raven distantly and asked if he was really scared. He began to move towards him in order to end the fight with one blow and get even with the Night Raven for the deaths that happened through his fault in this cave. The Night Raven was shocked to think that perhaps he would lose to such a weak warrior of the 1st rank, which was Xiao Ming. The guy did not let him continue his tirade and attacked him with his sword right in the center of his body. The Night Raven began to shout that this was impossible. This simply could not be. The guy raised his sword and struck his enemy with it, but the Night Raven easily parried his attack, causing an explosion that blinded Xiao Ming and confused him. Xiao Ming thought that it was very bad. The Night Raven, taking advantage of his opponent's temporary blindness, plunged 2 blades into his back, putting the guy into a stupor and misunderstanding of what had just happened. The Night Raven laughed ominously and said that his fencing technique was really impressive. Xiao Ming even managed to match him, but no more than that. He has 7 more blades left to plunge in, and then the guy will finally lose this battle. Xiao Ming abruptly turned around and shouted that he had enough time to destroy it. The Night Raven shouted that he was crazy. It was time for him to accept reality and accept it. Xiao Ming's opponent shouted that he was using the Bloody Massacre ability, the Blood Vine armor, which completely clung to him and made him look even more intimidating. The system entered information on the panel for Xiao Ming that the ability of Bloody Massacre is the armor of blood vines. Description: the life force forms a protective shell resembling a plexus of worms and blood vessels. A sea-level defensive skill created by the Night Raven's deformed aesthetic perception. It has strength and viscosity, which it is able to absorb attacks. At the same time, it has its own consciousness. The armor began to cover the body of the Night Raven, giving it a bright red color. He shouted that the cry of the Night Raven was like the ringing of a funeral bell for Xiao Ming in this battle. Xiao Ming whispered that it was an unusual armor and tried to pierce it with one blow. But the blow did not cause a scratch on the armor of the Night Raven. binding Xiao Ming's sword with him and preventing him from retreating for the next attack. The guy thought with annoyance that not only did this armor have high protection and durability, but it also turned out to be able to entwine his sword with its own will. He needs to come up with something urgently before it's too late. The Night Raven tried to strike, but Xiao Ming managed to use the vital energy explosion technique, causing his sword to glow with scarlet flames. Xiao Ming was able to get his weapon out of the Night Raven's armor without being hit. The Night Raven laughed and said that it was useless. Even if he used the sword energy, he would never pierce his bloody armor with his weak sword. The Night Raven smiled broadly and growled that 6 more blades and Xiao Ming's death would be inevitable. The guy thought that it seemed, on top of everything else, these shadow daggers were absorbing his life force, and according to the Night Raven, 12 wounds will create the effect of inevitable death. The guy whispered that, nevertheless, the Night Raven relies too much on the ability of his armor, and does not pay attention to defense at all. So the path to victory is crystal clear to him. All that needs to be done is to be able to break through his armor. Then victory will be on Xiao Ming's side. He remembered that in order to reach the unattainable limits in the art of swordsmanship, in his previous life he had performed countless sword swings to meet the sun. In those moments, Xiao Ming forgot about the weight of the sword in his hand, forgot that time could go on. The guy continued his attempts with wave after wave, and so it all came down to one thing: to stand in front of the light, the fastest light in that world, and dissect it. But in the end, it constantly turned out to be a failure for him. But one day, continuing his attempts, Xiao Ming was able to cut the sun into 8 whole pieces. He remembered this and reproduced everything from memory, defeating the Night Raven with 1 blow and finally winning this battle. The latter, from the force of Xiao Ming's blow, crashed into the floor of the laboratory, piercing it. The guy approached his opponent and whispered that at his current level of strength, he could show the power of the sword tip enough to take the life of the Night Raven with 1 blow. The Night Raven asked Xiao Ming why he possessed such a powerful swordsmanship technique. Directly above the Night Raven, the system displayed an alert on the panel that the target was already at death's door. Does Xiao Ming want to devour her? The guy whispered incredulously that he could really devour a person. It looks like this system wants him to eat a human for his height. The Night Raven shouted that how could he lose to a scum of the first rank like Xiao Ming? Xiao Ming turned to the Night Raven and asked why he used people as food for abnormal beasts. Because these people were not his enemies. Then why did he do it, and why? The Night Raven replied that they really were not his enemies, but they were of absolutely no value. Therefore, he turned worthless people into valuable blood crystals. As an alchemist, he was able to achieve greatness by creating a real miracle. Xiao Ming said that it was not for him to judge the value of other people. The Night Raven acted so simply to please his selfish desires. What kind of greatness can we talk about if he acts so meanly? The Night Raven replied to him that Xiao Ming was strong and he was weak. That's the only reason he can kill him. That's the only reason he can lecture him. After all, the strong can treat the weak as they please. And what about him? Doesn't he, like the Night Raven himself, act to please his desires? He said that when the abnormal beast dug its claws into him and tore off half of his face, he realized that weakness was the original sin, and the only fate of the weak is to be trampled under the feet of the strong. The weak are the food of the strong, that is the truth of this world. By eating the weak, they become even stronger, and Xiao Ming is no exception. Xiao Ming looked at him coldly and said that he would kill him not because he was weak, but for his vile deeds. The Night Raven was surprised and asked that Xiao Ming was a champion of justice. Let him tell you what right he has to judge his sins. Had he never done anything villainous himself? The system displayed information on the panel that Xiao Ming had been awarded a reward for achieving a breakthrough, the Hand of Retribution ability. The property of the attack is to break through the armor. The consumption is 200 points of vitality, along with 10% of the vitality of the enemy's defenses. At the same time, the system put up a reward for making a takeover, the ability to crystallize blood. The attack property consists in the auxiliary consumption of an entry-level blood crystal of 150 points of vitality. The guy read that it allows you to solidify your life force to form a blood crystal. It looks like he got this ability for absorbing the Night Raven, and now he can create a blood crystal with his bare hands. He shouted joyfully that no, he could create a lot of gold with his bare hands. From now on, he won't have to puzzle over where to get the money, and his sister won't have to work anymore. The system displayed the information on the panel again. A Life Force shopping mall was opened in it. Now you can exchange vitality points for special items there. Phoenix Guardian equipment. The price is 500 Life Force points, which allows you to repel an attack of the 5th rank and below once. Weapon improvement is a service. The price is 100 Life Force points, adds a special summoning property to the weapon. Xiao Ming said in disappointment that there were only 2 unfortunate names here, and it's also called a vending machine. And what kind of useless protective accessory is this? Is the system trying to dilute him for vitality points? He knelt down on one knee and said that improving weapons is much better than another name. At the same time, he picked up the Night Raven blade and tied it to his body. The system displayed a description of the item. The name is the Bloody Blade of Retribution, a special type of weapon, created from selected materials. After making 12 successful ones, he casts a Deathblow curse. The creation of this weapon was entrusted to a certain woman, whose curse it contains. Xiao Ming said to himself that the special effect of this weapon was quite good. Only, he didn't expect it to be a cursed item. It would be better not to use it too often. He walked over to the table where Night Raven was working. He found papers containing experimental data, as well as some secret codes. He will keep this for now. People from the Lona tribe covered all the dead with white sheets. Many people couldn't hold back their tears as they looked at their friends and comrades. Xiao Ming said he was sorry. When he went down into the cave, Sawyer was already breathing his last breath. The head of the tribe told him not to take it personally. After all, he had already achieved retribution for Sawyer. All the people of the tribe are grateful to him for his help. The head of the tribe shouted loudly for his people to take everything that could be useful, and the cave should be set on fire. Everything else that they can't take away will need to be undermined. People lit torches and threw them to the explosives in the depths of the cave. A couple of seconds later, a powerful explosion rang out, destroying the cave and the remaining supplies. The people of the Lona tribe loaded provisions and useful materials into trucks and went on foot. Lona, who was following Xiao Ming, suddenly felt that he had become a little taller than before, and his clothes were left in shreds, and there are traces of wounds on his body. Lona's father, the head of the tribe, thought that she was already at that age. He quickly took off his tribesman's clothes and told Xiao Ming that there was no living space left on his clothes, so he had to take these things. Smiling broadly, the head of the tribe said that he would dress him himself. The head of the tribe smiled broadly and shouted that the clothes fit very well. He picked up Xiao Ming's torn clothes and threw them to his tribesman, saying that he could put them on for now. Xiao Ming, who was walking in front, said that the Alchemist Guild's military camp might be destroyed, but it was unlikely that their forces were limited to one group. It's definitely not safe where their tribe is now. The head of the tribe agreed with him and said that he also thought so. When they returned to the village, he would immediately start looking for a new place for them to stay. After a while, they reached the village, which was located between the ruins of high-rise buildings. The locals, mostly women, shouted joyfully that the hunters had returned from their mission. Qin Ying joyfully ran up and shouted that it was Xiao Ming. She was very glad that he was all right, but he easily made her stop and not hug him, saying that impulsiveness was too dangerous. She replied sheepishly that she was too worried about him, so she did so. Xiao Ming put his hand on her head and told her that he was fine now and they could return home at any moment. Qin Ying happily replied that she understood. Lona, who was standing next to them and watching their conversation, asked if they were lovers. Qin Ying was immediately embarrassed and couldn't say a word. Xiao Ming replied with the same harshness that no, they were just classmates. Qin Ying tried to hold back a tear and thought that she seemed to have heard the sound of a broken heart. Sometime later, in the evening, Lona and Xiao Ming entered one of the tents. On the bed inside this tent was an old woman who was clearly ill. Lona lifted the flap of the tent and told her mother that she had brought a pharmacist to examine her. He will definitely help her get better. Xiao Ming looked closely at Lona's mother and asked what was on her face. It was the ornaments of a black snake. After all, such marks appear only after the bite of a black mamba. Lona replied wearily that yes, they had used all the methods they knew to get most of the toxins out. They managed to save her mother's life, but now the remnants of the poison cause her terrible suffering every day. Xiao Ming shook his head in puzzlement and said that he knew how to remove the poison of the black mamba. But to create an antidote, you will need special ingredients that are difficult to get. Lona and Xiao Ming went to the desert, where they found a huge abnormal crab beast. Lona screamed in fright that he really had this abnormal beast under special ingredients. She said that the shell of such a crab can only be pierced by an artillery shell, and now they can't even kill, they can't even chop off a leg. This is a bad idea, they need another plan. Xiao Ming smugly came out from behind the shelter and told Lona that no one knew if they would be able to do it. The abnormal crab beast noticed a guy walking towards it and prepared to attack. Xiao Ming raised his hand up and activated the Hand of Retribution ability. His hand multiplied in size and he easily grabbed a large abnormal crab beast. He raised his hand and squeezed the abnormal beast, destroying it. Lona, unable to believe her eyes, looked at Xiao Ming dumbfounded and opened her mouth in shock. She couldn't believe he could do it. Xiao Ming reduced his hand and grabbed the meat of the abnormal crab beast he had just destroyed. He handed it to Lona and said that now they could go back and make an antidote for her mother.